Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of The Admirals' Game, written by David Donachie, read by Peter Wickham. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Soundings, Whitley Bay, NE 26 2JT. Prologue. Being towed on a choppy sea made progress very slow, leaving Lieutenant John Pearce to wonder if the two pontoons would ever get into the desired position. Not that he was keen they should do so, it being highly probable that the flimsy platform on which he stood, designed for harbour work, loading livestock and the like onto anchored vessels, would be extremely vulnerable. Adapted for action, towed by boats and mounted with a pair of long-barrelled 24-pounder cannon, the platforms had been diverted to take part in an operation to subdue a newly constructed French artillery position, which had made vulnerable the extreme western section of the inner roads of the port of Toulon, known as the Petite Rade. At maximum range, the longest French gun, a 44-pounder culverin, was able to lay fire upon the main bastions defending the inner harbour, Fort Mulgrave, at the very south of the defensive perimeter, and the central redoubt, Fort Malbousquet. Left in peace, this new battery would serve as a stepping stone to push forward yet another artillery position, which would increase the threat to the whole anchorage. In time, such leapfrogging would render the situation of the Allied fleet untenable, and the defence of the port depended on those ships. The aim was, if possible, to destroy it. Failing that, to so discourage the gunners of the French Revolution that they would think long and hard about any further advance. In front of the pontoons, hardly visible in the grey morning light, lay the long, low, sandy shore of the Bay of La Seine, with the protective works of the French battery raising the profile of the land by several metres, hastily constructed earth and stone walls with cannon embrasures, and behind them an ancient stone building called La Chapelle de Préguerre. Even to an untrained eye like that of John Pearce, a naval officer by default rather than proper entitlement, the problem seemed obvious. The pontoon cannon would be firing from sea level at a target not much above that, when what was needed was plunging fire, mortars firing shells high enough to carry the breastworks and impact on the French guns, the men who worked them, as well as the powder stores needed to sustain their fire. "Here they come, thank God!" That heartfelt exclamation came from the man who had command of Pearce's pontoon. Though he refused to talk of it in those terms as if it were a rated ship, Lieutenant Henry Digby was engaged in a duty, and a damned unpleasant one, of the kind that made a serving naval officer wonder who in King George's navy he had upset. John Pearce, well aware of Digby's feelings on the matter, had not bothered to enlighten him. He guessed being posted on this undertaking, given from where the orders had originated, was a chastisement aimed squarely at him. Digby had spotted that the two capital ships designated to lead the attack had weighed and were slowly inching under topsails towards the eastern shore of the huge, sweeping outer bay, known as the Grande Rade. HMS St. George, a line of battleship bearing 98 guns, was the principal in this affair, flying aloft the flag of Rear Admiral Gell. Aurore, a 74-gun French vessel of shallow draught, now manned by British sailors, was in support. "Have they shifted any guns, sir?" asked Pearce. "None that I can see. The gun ports look pristine." They had discussed the possibility of such an act not long after receiving their orders. Lacking mortars, it made sense for Gell to shift his heavy lower-deck cannon to the upper deck, a hard and messy business for sure, which would require the carpenter to fashion some adjustments to the bulwarks, but one that would increase their range and elevate their effect. Digby had concluded that it was unlikely to happen, given it required imagination. He reckoned the higher most men rose in the service, the less given they were to innovation. "Time to fix our position, Mr. Pearce," Digby said. As always, when John Pearce picked up any instrument of nautical measurement, he felt a knot grip his stomach. The men who shared his rank had served a long apprenticeship of several years as midshipmen. Some, indeed, never rose above that station. In that time they learnt their trade under supervision, in an atmosphere in which allowance was made for trial and error. He had been taken from the rank of midshipman to lieutenant overnight by the personal order of King George, and it was at times like these he felt most keenly his lack of nautical experience, not least because the present requirement, the measurement of triangulation at sea, was damned tricky. His uncertainty was eased by the lieutenant commanding the other pontoon. Over the water came the shouted orders from him to prepare the anchors that would hold his gun platform in position, and since the one on which Pearce stood was to be placed in relation to that, he was able to say with some confidence they should do the same. "Make it so, Mr. Pearce." A shouted command to the towing boats had them ship their oars, then dip them again to hold the tow steady once what little way they had was moderated. Pearce watched the action of their consort closely, mirroring each act as it was executed. The 4 small anchors got ready, then the 2 rearmost dropped as the boats, under experienced coxswains working shoreside, once more took up the tow. When those had grounded, one boat held them in place while the second came close to take on 1 anchor at a time, the rope paying out as they rowed the required distance. Then it was dropped into the water, and after allowing time for it to sink to the seabed, the cable was attached to a small windlass and hauled in until it found firm ground and was taut. Once all 4 anchors were in position, each was adjusted to swing the pontoon into the required position vis-à-vis the enemy battery. Then the guns, lashed down to prevent them rolling around on the swell, were released, loaded and hauled up on their hastily constructed restraining tackles, a series of thick ropes threaded through heavy ring bolts fixed in the decking. Once the gunner had fitted the flints, their weapons were ready to fire. By that time the capital ships were also in position. The sun was up and shining into the faces of their opponents, with both pontoon commanders eyeing the mainmast halyards on St. George for the flags that would give the signal to open fire. At their own masthead, a stanchion, set amidships for the purpose, flew the plain red pennant that told Admiral Gell they were ready to oblige. Standing next to the cannon he would aim and control, Pearce was very close to men he saw as his closest companions, Michael O'Hagan, Charlie Taverner, and Rufus Dommett, 3 of the 8 men needed to serve the 24-pounder. Added to those friends were a couple of hands who had served with him before, had known him as both a common seaman and midshipman, and since they were out of the earshot of Digby, or those manning the other cannon, it was possible to talk quietly and without the usual rigorous attendance to strict naval discipline.
"Our friends on yonder shore seem in no hurry to disturb us," said Latimer, a sailor old for his occupation, with a well-lined, dark-skinned and leathery face to prove it. Long in the tooth, he had seen a great deal of sea service, and was generally held, not least by John Pearce, to be a wise old owl, worth listening to.
"Might have been worth a ball or 2 while we was fushing to get into place."
"Why alarm us when we are a better target anchored?"
"Happen you have the right of it, Mr. Pearce. But mark my words, I look on it to get warmer for long."
"Would that be smoke I see, John boy?" asked Michael O'Hagan. Even squatting, the Irishman was tall and muscular enough to dwarf those around him, including men strangers to both he and John Pearce, 1 or 2 of whom looked at Michael askance, that being no way for an ordinary tar to address an officer. They did not, of course, know the history, did not know that Michael, Charlie, Rufus, and John Pearce along with them had been brutally pressed into the King's service in an act of blatant illegality by a certain Captain Ralph Barclay. Pearce had coined the term pelicans to cover them, for that was the Thameside tavern in which they had first met, and through such an association they had a bond that transcended rank. It was Charlie who responded to the question.
"It might just be our friends cooking their breakfast, Michael."
"Happen if we send a boat, they'll spare us some,"
said Blubber Booth, who, as his nickname implied, was a man fond of his grub.
"All mates together, eh? Sharing our victuals and tall tales?"
Charlie Taverner's response was rendered unfunny by the sharpness with which he said the words. but that was in the nature of the man. Charlie liked to think of himself as a light-hearted cove, yet he was anything but when life was not going as he thought it should. Rufus, the youngest of the trio, employed his habitual silly grin to break up his freckles. He never saw the vinegar in Charlie's comments, only the humour. "I'll take one of the boats in and ask. I'm thinking I can smell chitterlings." "Sure," O'Hagan hooted. "You're daft enough, Rufus, but I doubt you'd like what they serve you, for it will not be parts of fowl. That smoke will be a fire for heating round shot." "I doubt they'll waste it on us," Pearce said, more in hope than certainty. "The ships are bigger targets." "Why bother?" Charlie added, his voice rising. "One decent aim with common shot will smash this thing to bits." "Belay that, Charlie," Pearce insisted, seeing the worried frowns on other faces, men who had obviously harboured the same thought. "The task is bad enough." "If we ain't in the frying pan we use with us, John Pearce, we's in the fire," called Latimer. "Can't quite work out if you seek trouble or it finds you." There were 30-odd sailors aboard this pontoon, drawn from several ships in the fleet, probably being the souls least loved by the Premier or their captain, and Pearce had to feel for them. There was no glory in this assignment, only danger, and no prospect of a prize and some coin to make the notion of risk worthwhile. As well as that, what they were about bore no relation to that for which they had been trained, to varying degrees of ability, rapid fire at point-blank range. Engaging a shore battery required slow and measured gunnery, with slight changes in elevation, increases and decreases in powder charges, and subtle movements on the anchors, which made the gunner the most important man aboard. Nothing happened for what seemed an age. No doubt there was much discussion taking place aboard HMS St. George, which allowed Pearce to look about him at a landscape still parched in late autumn. Various forts were set around the shores of the Grande Rade, while others covered the narrower fortified entrance to the Petite Rade, making the most of what was a fortress designed by nature. There was no fleet in the world big enough to crowd the outer anchorage, and with two promontories to protect it from the vagaries of both sea and weather, the inner roads provided a secure space for the largest warships, while right inshore lay a protected harbour, containing slips for shipbuilding, massive timber stores, and a fully functioning dockyard and arsenal. Toulon had been home to the French Mediterranean fleet since the time of Louis the Sun King, and the masts of that navy filled the port, all flying the Pavillon Royal, the French king's ensign of fleur-de-lis, not the tricolour of the France of 1789. Behind the town and the Vauban-designed fortress that formed the heart of the defence, the hills rose in steep steps to the wooded crest of Mount Faron, an observation point that made the place invulnerable to a surprise assault from the sea. The flatter sections dotted with more redoubts, both those of the defenders as well as the enemy. British marines and sailors, as well as Neapolitan, Piedmontese, and Spanish troops manned these positions. There was a unit of French royalists, but not of the number there should be, a worry given the population of Toulon. Too many of the locals were waiting to see which way the wind blew. The rest in the crowded town were refugees from the Terror and its mistress, the guillotine, which had been unleashed on the southern coast of France by the revolutionary armies, not least in the great port of Marseille, where the blood price for the insurrection against the madmen of Paris was said to run into thousands. "Flag signalling, Your Honour!" shouted the man detailed to watch. "As soon as the flagship fires, let us test the range," called Digby. Chapter 1. Admiral Lord Hood sat at his table in the great cabin of HMS Victory, dealing with a mound of papers which listed all the matters pertaining to his overall command of the Allied forces. That, since the British and Spanish fleets had taken over the defence of Toulon, was more than just keeping his own ships and men effective. He had to deal with French naval officers who had forsworn the revolution, a difficult Spanish ally on land as well as at sea, soldiers of foreign armies demanding provisions and orders, the civilian authorities in Toulon, every ruler of every state in the Mediterranean, and last, and very much not least, the confused attitude of his own government in London. Given sufficient numbers, Toulon was, as a place, easy to defend, ringed by high hills with narrow points of entry to east and west, which channeled the efforts of anyone seeking to subdue the port through its landward approaches. The best place to stop an assault from the most vulnerable point, to the east, was just beyond a village called Olioul, especially to contain an enemy approaching from Marseille. That had been narrowly lost early on, throwing the defenders back to an inner perimeter in which every inch of ground must be contested, hence the profusion of hillside redoubts. That still made the port a very tough nut to crack, yet it could not be held without the quantity of soldiers required to both fully man those redoubts and provide a mobile defensive reserve. And he did not have them. Hood's enemies outnumbered his forces, were being reinforced continuously, and also had access to all the heavy armaments in the country behind, allowing them to gather a formidable amount of siege-caliber cannon. With such an advantage, they had begun to push forward their artillery, and he lacked the means to stop them, namely 12 regiments of redcoats or equivalents. His request that such men be sent out from England had received a cool response, barring a detachment promised from the garrison at Gibraltar. The latest dispatches from home also contained an unpleasant communication which could be read as a rebuke. Sam Hood had been obliged to rid Toulon of some 5,000 rebellious French sailors from the Atlantic ports, and there had been only one sensible way to settle such a problem. He could not just let them go to reinforce the armies besieging Toulon, nor could he find any neutral nation willing to take them. To keep 5,000 radicals incarcerated in Toulon, given the trouble they could cause, was out of the question. So he had been forced to send them back from whence they came. This he had done using 4 French 74-gun ships stripped of their cannon. The problem identified by London was one of which he had been well aware. Once in their home ports, the French Navy would merely have to re-gun those vessels to return them to service, and instead of being a distant threat in the Mediterranean, they were now in some proximity to the English Channel. Not an outcome likely to please an admiralty or a nation for whom the security of that stretch of water was the primary strategic concern. Nearly as unwelcome were the private dispatches from the King's First Minister, William Pitt. If Sam Hood was a successful admiral with an impressive record, he was also a political animal who had been, prior to taking up his command, the senior naval lord on the Board of Admiralty and a strong supporter of Pitt's Tory government. These private letters constantly urged him to treat his second-in-command, Admiral Sir William Hotham, with some consideration. Not easy, since he had no time for the man in question, either as an admiral or as a political opponent. The Duke of Portland, a leading Whig politician, had split his party to form a supportive coalition government with William Pitt. Both men were committed to fighting the French Revolution, but that did not mean politics failed to intrude into what was an uneasy alliance. Portland sought increased ministerial positions for his adherents. Pitt sought to minimize the power he gave away. Admiral Sir William Hotham was a staunch supporter of Portland, and the latter in consequence had already received several missives from Hotham questioning Hood's actions, both in taking over the port of Toulon and the manner of his agreement with the French naval authorities. He had agreed to hold the port and fleet in trust instead of accepting a surrender, along with a great deal of what had happened since.
"Damn me, Parker," Hood moaned. "They ask a great deal. Treat Hotham with kid gloves? I'd like to chuck the bugger in a cable tier."
The person so vehemently addressed, Rear Admiral Hyde Parker, in his capacity as Hood's captain of the fleet, acted as the executor of his superior's wishes. If the fleet was run on standards set by Hood, it was Parker who implemented them. He was therefore of necessity both a friend and ally of his commanding officer, as well as the sounding board against which Hood could let off steam.
"Tread carefully, they say," Hood added, "without even acknowledging that a man is at trial."
Hood was the master of a good scowl, having the craggy visage, the prominent nose, and the bushy eyebrows to give it effect. Parker was smoother by far. Indeed, there was a touch of excess in the flesh of his body, replicated in his smooth and rosy-cheeked countenance. While Hood had an air of activity and impatience about him with a tongue to match, Parker seemed to reek of passive contentment, which was as it should be. Two irascible souls seeking to work in tandem to control a fleet could be a recipe for trouble. "I was looking over the papers on Captain Barclay's court-martial," Parker said.
"A travesty,"
Hood growled, wondering at the abrupt change of subject.
"He gets no more than a reprimand, which is like a slap on the wrist, but the man is fit to be drummed out of the service."
Hood had little time for Captain Ralph Barclay of the frigate HMS Brilliant, and that had applied prior to the recent court-martial, the charge being one of illegal impressment. He and Hood had clashed in London at the beginning of the year, before either man sailed for the Mediterranean. Barclay, ordered to weigh from Sheerness, complained that he lacked the hands necessary to man his frigate. Despite a verbal warning from Hood to have a care in how he resolved that dilemma, Barclay had led out a press gang. That in itself was not a worry. It was the chosen location which caused the problem, a section of the Thames riverside known as the Liberties of the Savoy. Seeking to press men for sea service within the boundaries of the Liberties was an act forbidden by ancient statute. Pushed to institute a court-martial by John Pearce, one of the victims of that press gang, he had handed the matter over to Hotham as a quid pro quo for his support in the issue of removing those French sailors to the Atlantic ports. His second-in-command had rigged matters in the most shameless way to get the result he wanted for an officer to whom he had recently become a patron. Not only had he sent away any hostile witnesses, John Pearce included, but by choosing the captains to sit in judgment, as well as a useless prosecutor, he had made sure Barclay received the right verdict. Given these terse communications from London, Hood also had good grounds to think that Hotham had reneged on the agreement by writing to Portland to question the action to which he had agreed, which had him add, with a sigh,
"I am, Parker, obliged to confirm the verdict."
"Are you so obligated, sir?" Hood looked hard at his fleet captain, who did not flinch from the glare.
"I did give Hotham my word."
"It strikes me, sir," Parker insisted, "that Admiral Hotham has broken his word, indeed has taken greater advantage of your indulgence than is strictly warranted. In fact, I would say his chicanery in this matter, both in his arrangements for Barclay's court-martial and writing to London in a manner designed to undermine you, is so blatant as to constitute an insult to your flag." Hood raised his eyes to the deck beams, as though he could see through the planking and the captain's cabin above his head to the flag that flew at the masthead, which designated his command as that of a vice-admiral of the White Squadron.
"I doubt he has much respect for my flag."
Parker, who had been sitting back at his ease, pushed himself forward, hands on his ample, straddled thighs. "If I can reprise what he has done, sir—"
"Go on,"
Hood interrupted, giving his captain of the fleet a penetrating look designed to warn him not to waste his time. "He took, or rather you gave him, responsibility for the matter of investigating Captain Barclay's supposed illegalities."
"I rather think the illegalities are a fact, not a supposition."
"Which makes it doubly galling that Admiral Hotham saw fit to so rig the court to guarantee Barclay a mere reprimand. Not only did he ensure that the witness statements his secretary took were not introduced to the court, he sent away on that mission to the Atlantic ports not only those who made them, but anyone who had evidence to damn Barclay, and in particular his chief accuser."
"He went that far?"
"I have good grounds to believe so, sir, and I have a list of those who were affected."
"You've been busy."
"On your behalf, sir."
"What a fine set of blackguards they are, Parker," Hood growled. "To me, John Pearce and Sir William Hotham are of the piece, although I would hazard that Pearce is the more truthful of the pair."
"Then you will be interested to know, sir, that Lieutenant Pearce is threatening to bring a case of perjury against Barclay."
"Is he, by damn!"
Hood exclaimed, before his eyes narrowed and fixed on his junior admiral.
"And how, Parker, do you know this?"
"Is it not my job, sir, to know what is going on in your command, and so be in a position to advise you?"
Hood barked at him then. "And sometimes on occasion, Parker, to thwart me with your opinions."
The reply was as nonchalant as the man who made it. "I would be remiss if I was afeard to do that, sir."
"Perjury."
"Reading the transcripts of the given evidence, the case against Berkeley is weakened by his not giving much in the way of personal testimony. It seems he declined to explain his actions, merely referring to that which had already been sworn by other witnesses. However, he did accept the prior evidence given as being true, and allowed the court to do the same. These I suspect to be lies he had engineered from those people he allowed to be called, which smacks of a conspiracy, an offence worse than mere perjury."
"You seem damn sure he did that, Parker."
"I have good reason."
"If you say the case is weak—"
Hood waved a hand, as if to say the matter was not one worth the pursuit, which elicited from his executive officer a wolfish grin. "It seems one of those so suborned by Berkeley, and perhaps the one most likely to be perjured, is his wife's nephew, a certain midshipman called Toby Burns. From what I have gleaned, the lad is not one to stand up to pressure. Get him in the same court as his uncle, with any form of decent prosecution, and Berkeley would be doomed."
Hood was growling again, clearly dissatisfied. "I am wondering, Parker, how it is that you seem to be in possession of information which is not, from my previous reading of the case papers, very obvious."
"I made a few discreet inquiries, sir, and found out that which I am now passing on to you."
"Am I to be told with whom you spoke?"
"I would decline to do that, sir. It would not aid your situation to be seen as actively engaged in undermining Admiral Hotham. Better that, in a tight situation where some of this may come to light, you can justifiably plead innocence."
"Where's all this leading, Parker?"
"Let us accept Ralph Berkeley illegally pressed Pearce and those other fellows out of that Thameside tavern." Hood nodded. "Then let us also accept that Admiral Hotham, in order to protect an officer who has attached himself to his flag, has allowed, indeed connived in allowing, a blatant miscarriage of justice to be perpetrated, one in which he could be shown to be complicit."
"It would need to be proved, but for the sake of your point we will allow it."
"It therefore stands to reason that Pearce and his proposed action for perjury represents a threat to both Captain Berkeley and Admiral Hotham."
"Only if it comes to court, and we both know how difficult that is."
"It is, however, like a sword of Damocles over both men, which is why I believe that Hotham, should he hear about Pearce's proposed course of action, will do everything in his power to ensure it does not come to court. What concerns me is the means he will use to achieve that end."
"Which are?"
"Right now, Lieutenant Pearce and the fellows he wants released from the Navy, the men he insists were illegally pressed with him, are aboard the pontoons ranged against the French battery, which I believe they have named Sans-Culotte."
"Them and their damn silly names. Without breeches, indeed."
It was like a signal. The rolling sound of cannon fire filled the air. Then the casements of the spacious cabin rattled slightly at the displacement of atmosphere, even although it was over a mile away.
"Shell has begun the action, Parker. I need to see this."
Parker hauled himself to his feet, as Hood did likewise. Hats were handed over by a steward as they made their way out onto the long main deck of the flagship, with Hood acknowledging the knuckled forehead salutes of those who resided there. Sprightly for a man of his 69 years, he skipped up the companionway, which brought everyone on Victory's quarterdeck to attention, the watch officers raising their hats as one.
"A telescope?"
Hood demanded, and the long glass was immediately pressed into his hand, a second being provided for Parker. HMS St. George and Aurore were both wreathed in the smoke from their own cannon,
the 2 pontoons likewise. Hood followed the course of the second salvo to see it land on the sandy shore, throwing up a great plume of earth, short of the actual target. It took several minutes to reload and adjust the charges before the next salvo followed.
"He's not achieving much, Parker. All he's doing is shifting the shoreline."
"If he edged in closer—"
"The French have equal range and heated shot. He'll risk the ship if he does."
"And that damned culverin."
"They won't waste that on a ship. Barrel must be fairly old, so they'll keep it for the forts."
A long silence followed before Hood asked quietly,
"So what are you suggesting I do about this perjury thing, Parker?"
"I am suggesting, sir," Parker replied in a like manner, there being a clutch of eavesdroppers nearby, "that keeping John Pearce alive would be to your advantage."
"The duty he is about is not guaranteed to kill him."
"No, but Admiral Hotham, should he get wind of what Pearce intends, has it in his power, thanks to you placing him under his direct command, to put him in danger at any time he chooses. The most exposed battery on shore, perhaps, or taking the lead in an attack that carries great risk. If I was to put odds on Pearce's survival under those circumstances, I would not rate them as very high."
"You think I need to protect him?"
"In doing so, you may well protect yourself, sir."
The ramifications of that did not need to be enumerated. It was as plain as the prominent nose on Hood's face. Protect Pearce, and he would have a counter to Hotham's baleful influence in London. The implied threat of a case brought against Ralph Berkeley by John Pearce, which must of necessity drag in Hotham, would curtail his writing home to his political supporters in a way that undermined this command.
You cannot, of course, aid Pearce in bringing his case for perjury. Once he has done that, he ceases to be a viable threat.
God, Parker, you're worse than a Whig, or a Jacobin, for that matter. Give me an enemy to fight that I can see plain."
"I think we need a decision, my lord."
"Get Pearce off that damned pontoon."
"I would say it is too late for that, sir. But for the sake of your security, we should fetch off from under Hotham's command not only Pearce, but also the men for whom he is fighting, whom he romantically refers to as his pelicans."
"So it is not just the French who indulge in silly names?"
"No, sir. And I think it would be unfortunate if Admiral Hotham failed to hear of the threat he faces," Parker added.
"A hint to keep him honest."
Parker responded with a wolfish grin and a voice larded with insincerity.
"We Admirals must stick together, sir, and I reckon the sooner Admiral Hotham is apprised of it, the better. I would be inclined to send him a note at once."
"Make it so, Parker,"
Hood replied. His telescope was concentrated on the smoke-wreathed pontoon on which those named were serving.
"Mind, your shenanigans could be a waste of time. That fellow Pearce is such a contrary bugger he will likely find a way to get his head blown off this very day."
Chapter 2. Digby's first salvo had landed well short in the shallows, sending up great cascades of water mixed with sand, but doing no damage whatsoever to the enemy, given there was not even an onshore breeze to soak them with spray. It was some relief that the great guns of both capital ships had also misjudged the range. In fact, given the smaller calibre of their upper-deck cannon and the low elevation of their heavy armament, they had landed in deeper water. That lack of a wind also meant both pontoons and line of battleships were wreathed in black, acrid smoke, which took time to clear. This while Digby entered into careful discussion with the gunner. A worried individual called Jenkins, he agreed the charges needed to be increased, though he was loath to go too far in that direction, for fear of blasting apart the barrels.
"If this don't do the trick, Your Honour, we must move a tad inshore," Jenkins insisted in his lilting Welsh accent.
He sat in a gimcrack temporary booth made of slatted timber covered in soaked canvas, as protection against a spark that might ignite his store of powder, with Digby having to lean over to talk to him in the gap through which he passed his loaded cartridges.
These be French guns, and I don't know what they will bear in terms of powder. I would not be one to be trusting any works carried out by John Crapo."
"They will likely be as well made as any of our own cannon, Jenkins."
Officer or no, Digby got a look that told him in no uncertain terms he was wrong. He turned to find John Pearce by his side, looking worried.
"Did you see the effect of that salvo on our anchor cables, sir?"
"No, I did not.
I fear for the strain on them. I was wondering if we could fire one cannon at a time to ease it." "Let me observe the effect, Mr. Pearce, and make a judgment. The two firing together do have a greater impact."
He pointed to the second pontoon.
"In fact, if we could time our action to the other fellow, landing 4 shots simultaneously, it might be much more valuable."
Pearce nodded and, without being asked, hailed one of their boats, instructing the coxswain to pass on the thought to the other officer in command. This while the cannon on his own pontoon were reloaded with the heavier charge. Clearly the capital ships had undertaken the same measure, for they fired off another salvo that at least cleared the shoreline, though it still fell short of the redoubt.
"Gun captains," Digby called, "we must try to fire on what little uproll we have from the swell."
That acknowledged, they waited until a slight wave lifted the rear of the pontoon, pulling their lanyards to fire the flints as it ran underneath them, the balls emerging just as it raised slightly the shore-facing edge. Digby was watching the fall of shot, Pearce the strain on the forward anchor cables as the cannon recoiled. Brought up on their relieving tackles, what force the weight of the cannon created was transferred through the ring bolts to the planking below, sending the pontoon back to strain the anchors.
"Mr. Pearce,"
Digby called, as he waited until his second-in-command joined him.
"I fear that old warrior of a gunner is right about the barrels, but even if he's wrong, I am obliged to take on board what he says. We must decrease the range."
The solution was simple, and copied by their consort. They paid out the sea anchors and hauled in on the shore side, and this time it was their consort copying them. Likewise, Admiral Gell was backing and filling to get further inshore.
"Our friends yonder have yet to return fire. They still have the sun in their eyes, Mr. Pearce, and I reckon once that is high enough, they will oblige us with a response. Besides, they will be under the command of an artillery officer, and probably he will have a better understanding of range. Once they know we're far enough inshore to be a real threat, we will be well served."
Given it was fire at will, the other officer opened up first from the new position, which sent up 2 great piles of earth and sand right at the front of the newly erected French revetments. Digby was in the process of acknowledging the improvement when one of the second pontoon's anchor cables snapped from the strain. The broken rope whistled at head height across the deck, sending men diving to avoid it, while, one corner released, the platform swung away from its fixed position. As it did so, the French cannon finally spoke, sending 2 visible black objects arcing towards their target, balls which straddled the swinging pontoon. Indeed, it seemed that the misfortune of the severed cable might have been of some salvation. Digby had little time to express his concern, as another pair of cannon fired on him, though they overshot to land in the sea 100 yards behind. A worry, since even if he moved his pontoon back to the original anchor point, they would still be in danger. Yet it was immediately obvious they were not the main target. The remainder of the battery opened up, a dozen cannon, all firing at HMS St. George. Some hit water and made spouts, but a couple struck timber, and the sound of rending wood rumbled across the bay. On a sturdy 98-gunner, the damage was not in any way terminal, but it did indicate that Gell's flagship was vulnerable. Digby shouted, alluding to the parted rope.
"On the flint lanyards! 1 cannon at a time! The cables will not bear the recoil."
All the advantage lay with the shore batteries, firing as they were from fixed positions on solid ground. At sea, though it was not running strong, they were at the mercy of even the slightest movement, snubbing on the cables as the currents moved them one way or the other, always firing from a slightly different elevation due to the effect of the swell, for it was impossible to correctly time the best point of discharge.
So it was a measure of the luck of the pontoons that the first salvos aimed at them looked to be the most dangerous, given that what followed came nowhere near. "Powder's no use," said Jenkins, when a crouching Digby asked his opinion as to the failure of their opponents to strike home. "Rotten French muck." The lieutenant forbore to point out to the Welshman that the powder he was using to fill his charges came from the arsenal of Toulon, and was thus also French muck. In reality, because the commander of that shore battery was concentrating on the capital ships, they were in receipt of very little counterfire. Michael O'Hagan's prediction of heated shot came to pass in short order, though again not aimed at them. Very visible in clear morning air, the red-hot metal left a trail of smoke, which did not immediately increase on contact. In the sea it landed with a steam-inducing hiss, but if it hit wood, it could embed itself and thus begin a conflagration which might well, if it got out of hand, completely destroy the ship. Their consort, now rigged to a spare anchor, was able to come back into the action, and that was the point at which both John Pearce and Digby realized why they were being so lightly treated. They had possessed only half their maximum firepower, but once that was remedied, a quartet of cannon was assigned to deal with them. Safety, if it existed at all, came from being a small target on a large expanse of seawater, so the French gunners would have to be precise, and that required luck. The concomitant of that was less rosy. The longer the action continued, the more chance they had of success. In short, luck for the target tended to be a diminishing asset. After an hour, John Pearce was black from head to foot, covered in the soot released by the powder, and more than once he had been obliged to smack out something singeing his coat and breeches, scraps of wad from a discharge still burning but unspent. Likewise the gun crews, who were also sweating copiously, straining mightily to swab, worm, and load, carrying both powder and the heavy cannonballs, then hauling the huge cannon across the deck to its firing position. They had a butt of clean water from which to assuage their thirst, though Digby, knowing they might have to stay on this station till twilight, had put a steady hand to control the use of the ladle. It was plain to the naked eye that the line of battleships were not winning the contest. Columns of smoke where red-hot shot had struck rose from several parts of St. George and Aurore. It was also clear their bulwarks were taking a severe damage from common round shot, and every time a ball struck home the wrenching sound of torn wood filled their ears. They, being too distant, were spared the screams of those affected by the splinters such a mauling must produce. The sound of cannonballs hitting the water all around the pontoons had almost assumed a rhythm of endless waterspouts, each greeted with a jeering response from the British tars. That was shattered, as was the deck of their consort, when finally the French gunners scored a hit. Luckily the ball landed between the two cannon, but it gouged out great splinters of wood which speared in all directions, so although the guns remained unscathed, that could not be said of the crews. Worse was the manner in which it bounced on, taking out the gimcrack hutch that housed their gunner. That just disintegrated, with slats being thrust into the sea, and, judging by the spurts of blood and gore, he went with them, leaving everyone standing rock-still waiting to see if the powder exploded, which could be fatal for them all. The screams of those wounded came across the strip of intervening water, dragging every eye to observe what they could of the carnage. Digby had to shout to his men that they should attend to their duties. Yet it was with one eye on the order and another on the damaged deck that they complied, witnessing the wounded being dragged to a place away from the cannon, but certainly not safety. There was no below decks to retire to, just an area of planking at as much risk as any other. The gods smiled then, for no doubt due to a very slight change in the powder measure, the next salvo hit the sea a few feet to the rear of the pontoon, missing everyone standing as it flew across the damaged deck just before it struck the water. At its lowest, it could not have been much above waist height. "Mr. Pearce, we must assist our consort with some of our powder." "They have called in a boat to take off the wounded, sir. I will employ that."
Such casualties as had been sustained might have been bearable if they had been inflicting the same on the enemy, but from what could be seen, and that was extremely limited, the whole attacking force was doing not much more than shifting earth. The mounds thrown up to defend the position, being loose, also served to absorb and nullify the force of any round shot that had the right range. Once in receipt of a supply of filled cartridges, both pontoons were soon back in action.
"Can't be long till our turn, Your Honour,"
said Latimer, in between loading and ducking every time the enemy replied.
"And if it hits us aforeship, we'll be matchwood."
John Pearce had a duty then to tell Latimer, much as he respected the old fellow, to shut up. They were here, and there was not a lot to do about it. No retirement was possible without an express order from Admiral Gell, so they just had to lump it. But the words had him looking to the boats that had towed them, now out of range, rocking peacefully on the swell, oars at rest. He also tried to calculate the distance to the nearest part of the shore not occupied by the French, and reckoned in the warm Mediterranean water he would have little trouble in swimming to safety should the pontoon seem set to sink. Yet that certainly did not apply to many others. If there was one mystery John Pearce could never fathom, it was the fact that so few sailors could swim. It seemed to him like an absolute necessity of the occupation, yet all he had ever heard was that in danger of drowning, tars had only one aim: to find enough drink to ensure that when they did succumb to lungs full of water, they would do so in a state of inebriated oblivion. "I wonder, sir, if we might ask the boats to move in closer," he said, joining Digby. "They would be endangered by that, Mr. Pearce." "If I may say so, sir, the men aboard this pontoon are endangered by the distance they are sitting off from us. If we are struck in any serious fashion, this deck will not serve to keep many alive." "A risk we must take, Mr. Pearce." Both were forced to duck then, as a ball whistled over their heads to land in the sea. Pearce knew there was no point in asking Digby if he could swim. Nothing would alter his need to do his duty, that being a subject on which he and his superior had crossed swords before. Digby had only his naval career to give him any hope of advancement. John Pearce had no desire to prosper in the service. His sole aim, indeed his entire presence on this station, was exclusively to do with the need to fulfill a promise made to his pelicans to get them free from the bonds of false impressment. He also had a deep desire to see in the dock at the Old Bailey the man who had brought them to this. "I feel the men would be happier if they thought the risk a shared one, sir." Digby did not look at him, but there was a tense note in his voice. "You are not telling me I hope that they would refuse their duty?" The reply from Pearce was not tense. It was terse. Nothing got his ire more than a blind sense of obligation to orders, however idiotic. "No, sir. But I am saying that it would be a pleasing thought that if the worst happens, the men manning the guns might, instead of drowning, survive to fight another day." He heard Digby take in a deep breath, and he guessed that in being so tactless he had probably dented any chance of his superior relenting. Happenstance came to his aid, as another ball flew in, this time striking his pontoon on the very furthest edge, removing a sizable chunk of timber but bouncing off to ricochet harmlessly into the sea. The sound was worse than the effect, as both men stared at the gap torn in the timbers. Obviously, if that same shot had hit further in, the platform on which they stood might have been so damaged as to be unable to remain afloat. A new sound from the flagship echoed across the bay, a booming reverberation that was not from a fired cannon, but one much louder, which had Digby searching for the cause through his telescope. He could observe little, but there seemed to be a sense of confusion on the quarterdeck, which he had to assume meant the vessel had been hit hard. "Flag signalling, Your Honour!" called the lookout unnecessarily. Digby shifted his telescope to the mainmast, but with the advent of an offshore breeze, the message could be seen with the naked eye. Admiral Gell was breaking off the action, and HMS St. George swung round, followed by Aurore, presenting to the pontoons the side of the ships that had faced the enemy, allowing those manning them to see the extensive damage they had sustained, with only the lookouts in the tops having any real notion of whether they had replied enough in kind. Just as troubling as the smashed bulwarks and blown-in scantlings was the signal at the masthead of the flagship, which Digby read out. "Engage the enemy more closely." There was disbelief in his voice, and John Pearce shared that when he heard it. If a ship mounting a dozen 32-pounders on one side of her lower deck could not sustain the action, what chance did they have? For once the line of battleships were out of range, they would be the only target left. "He surely cannot be asking us to move closer inshore." "We have hauled up as much as we dare on our shoreside anchors," Pearce said. "To move in further would mean—" "I know what it would mean, Mr. Pearce." The boats would have to come in, manoeuvre the pontoons to pluck the anchors from the seabed, execute various tows in different directions to get the platform set again, and all the while they would be at the mercy of that battery, more so than they were now, without even the ability to return fire, for nothing could be done with the cannon being secured. "I think that is an instruction you can easily ignore, sir." "Yet our friend yonder is calling in his boats." "He's a fool." "He is a naval officer, Mr. Pearce, doing what is required of him." "Sir, we have been lucky so far. That would hardly last in our present position, let alone closer inshore." "Nevertheless, Mr. Pearce, you must call in our boats." Pearce hesitated until Digby added, "I think that having served together these last weeks and knowing how I backed you off La Rochelle, I can count on your support." John Pearce had no choice but to comply. He did owe him for that, having indulged in an extremely risky venture to rescue some French officers in danger of being guillotined. On that voyage to the Bay of Biscay and back, acting as escort to the returning French sailors, he had come to know his commanding officer well. He liked Henry Digby, even if he thought him to have a parochial mind, blinkered religious views, and limited experience of the world. That had consisted of a rural life till aged 13, with some schooling thrown in, followed by the cloistered world of a midshipman's berth in the Royal Navy, and finally his examination and elevation to his present rank. The fellow seeking to dissuade him had experienced much variation in his life, and, in possession of a wider understanding of the world, he had an independence of mind not granted to someone like Digby. Not for John Pearce a normal childhood. He had followed his father around the country as his parents sought to spread his message by pen and speech that the world in which his countrymen lived was a corrupt entity, suited to those with wealth, while being inimical to the well-being of those without. Adam Pearce, the so-called Edinburgh ranter, had a strong sense of his own virtue, a wide range of knowledge, and trenchant opinions, plus the benefit of that most precious asset for a man of slender means, a Scottish education, first from the Kirk School, followed by a deep reading of the classics at Edinburgh University, much of which he had passed on to his son. In consequence, John Pearce had a familiarity with much not vouchsafed to a naval officer, or many other people for that matter. He had met famous men, visited endless towns, stayed in great houses and leaky barns, slept under the summer stars, walked the edge of crowds listening to his father speak, collecting in his cap the means they needed to eat, if they were enthralled to the message, looking for the means of swift departure, if they were hostile. He had sat close to his father as he conversed among people with opinions of interest, though rarely of wholehearted agreement, suffered with him a spell in the Fleet prison, and, forced to flee a King's Bench warrant for sedition, reached his manhood in the hothouse of a Paris newly liberated from the stultifying grip of absolute monarchy. Yet Pearce also knew Henry Digby to be trapped. Decline the order, and he would be branded a coward. He could certainly be finished in the service. Obey, and he might well perish. To a man in his position there was no alternative, and he was worthy of support, so picking up the speaking trumpet, Pearce called in their boats. This while Digby ordered the cannon to be secured, though left loaded for immediate reuse. As these orders were being issued, the French artillerymen were giving the line of battleships a send-off to remember.
Even when they were out of range, they peppered the sea with shot, throwing up high spouts of seawater that looked like celebration. They were also telling the whole fleet that when it came to supplies, they had enough cannonballs and powder to waste on what was a demonstration. Finally, they let fly with their largest cannon, the culverin, which had initiated the Allied response, a single shot that showed those ships were still in range, as a warning to stay well away from that particular shore. The boats came in slowly. Clearly the coxswains shared the view that what they were about was reckless. A loud and cursing Pearce had the oars digging harder, for if Digby could be diminished by non-compliance to an order, common seamen could be strung up at the yardarm for the same thing. Seeing them put their backs into their oars, Pearce went to where his pelicans were now gathered round the windlass, waiting to ply the anchors, well aware that none of them could swim.
"I think I was going to ask to serve under another officer, Mr. Pearce," said Blubberbooth. "Old Latimer here was right. Being with thee's too dangerous."
"I heard yous already had one barkie sunk under you, your honour," said a sailor standing within earshot, a man unknown to Pearce.
"Then take comfort from it, fellow, for I am still here. If this damned thing we're sat on is hit—"
"When?" Charlie Taverner said. Pearce ignored the interruption.
"If it begins to break up, find a large piece of timber and hang on to it. Even if our boats can't do the job, there are plenty more out there with the fleet, so rescue will come quick, and the water is warm."
"Ah, cut it, lads," hooted a grinning Latimer. "And let's cling to the wreckage."
"How can you be so jolly at a time like this?" demanded Charlie.
"No choice, shipmate, no choice."
"Holy Christ in heaven!" cried Michael O'Hagan, who was looking over Pearce's shoulder. He spun round to see, arcing through the air, trailing 2 lines of smoke, the first heated shot they had faced. What was worse, before the twin balls hissed into the sea, the whole battery opened up, having now aimed their guns at the pontoons. The air was suddenly full of flying metal, sound, and displaced water. The first strike was again on their consort, and this time it hit on the barrel of one of the cannon, which slewed sideways, breaking its restraints with such force that it tipped the pontoon into a sudden list. Pearce watched in horror as the 2 bluecoats aboard, a lieutenant and a midshipman, rushed to try and keep it from capsizing them, only to be carried by it into the water as it tipped overboard, sliding into the sea with them screaming underneath.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
All around him the sea boiled as ball after ball struck home, and he found himself emitting blaring and blasphemous imprecations at the boats to tow them out of danger.
"Mr. Pearce!"
Digby shouted, and Pearce turned to see him standing as if nothing untoward had happened, telescope tucked under his arm, speaking trumpet in his hand, his stance and face one of total normality.
"Our duty, sir."
He raised the trumpet and called to the other pontoon to inquire about the officers, but all he received from that was a negative shrug from the men too busy seeing to those who had worked that piece, many of whom had serious wounds. Next he ordered all the boats to steer the damaged platform so they could form one entity, double madness to Pearce, since it increased the size of the target. That it proved to be so was no cause for satisfaction. The French gunners were flushed with success. They had driven off the capital ships, so these 2 platforms were going to be no more than icing. With the range closing, they had elevated their guns, an easy thing to achieve on land-based ramps, so that now the 2 pontoons were subjected to a more plunging form of fire. The next salvo arced much higher, and came down upon them from a greater height, so that when one landed 10 feet from John Pearce, it shook the whole structure as it went right through the deck timbers, leaving behind it a wide hole with jagged wooden edges. That the pontoon could stand, though the same could not be said for any flesh close enough to be struck. It was the shots that hit the edge that were the danger, for under the decking there lay the sealed empty barrels that kept the thing afloat. It soon became obvious that they did not need to be hit directly.
Pearce saw the staves of one barrel fly into the air from a ball that hit the water close by. Break open enough of those, and the whole thing would sink from the weight of the guns alone. Digby had finally realized the situation was hopeless. He was now yelling through the speaking trumpet, ordering the anchor cables cut so the boats could haul them out and clear. When Pearce joined him, he said, though his face was gloomy, "There is a way of difference, I think, between discretion and valour, sir." They could see the oarsmen in the boats, all now towing in a seaward direction, near to standing as they strained at their sticks, this while they and the pontoons were subjected to a withering fire. The heated shot that hit Digby's pontoon did not go through the planking. It embedded itself within a foot of the gunner's hutch and began immediately to burn the splintered wood around it. John Pearce did not wait for instructions. If the powder in that hutch went up, they would all be blown apart. Grabbing Michael, the strongest man aboard, he began to wrestle the coop clear of the deck, yelling at the gunner to get out. Digby had called to any man free to find some means of extinguishing the fire with seawater. But it was Charlie Taverner, quick-thinking as was his way, who tipped the butt of drinking water onto the embedded ball. It was not enough to prevent it reigniting, but it was enough to delay the progress of the fire it had started, enough to allow Michael and Pearce to get the powder barrel and sling it, and many remaining charges, into the Mediterranean. The ball burnt away the ragged timber supporting it, and it too dropped into the sea below as, agonizingly slowly, still showered with seawater from near misses, the two pontoons were finally hauled out of range. Chapter 3. In the hospital, at the very tip of the Saint-Mandrier Peninsula, jutting far out to form the southern arm of the Grande Rade, Heinrich Lutyens carried on his surgeon's work, paying no attention to the near-continuous gunfire that made the shutters rattle on every window. It was too commonplace a thing to remark upon, a daily backdrop to the siege. A whole tranche of wounded men had just come in from HMS St. George, where a lower-deck cannon had burst with such force it had blasted its way up through the other decks, maiming and killing from inception and progress. The floor was awash with blood, and the tub for amputated limbs had been well employed. He supposed himself and his patients to be relatively safe, even if he also, on one side of the building, overlooked the Bay of La Seine. In terms of strategic value, he had been assured this part of the landmass had little to recommend it to the enemy, the seat of their efforts being directed towards the inner harbour of Toulon. Besides, the peninsula had an easily defended and narrow causeway joining it to the mainland, protected by artillery and soldiers, one that would result in a great effusion of blood if attacked, and with little to gain from the attempt. The French cannon might be on the opposite side of that causeway, but their offensive weaponry was aimed elsewhere. Lutyens had come to this place, technically, as a prisoner, when Ralph Barclay, sent to gain intelligence on the state of the Toulon fleet, had foolishly engaged a superior force of 2 heavier frigates, HMS Brilliant being taken as a prize. His task then had been to tend the wounded from that action, the sailors with whom he had weighed from Sheerness. Released from that imprisoned state when the good folk of Toulon, along with a substantial number of French naval officers, had decided to forsake the revolution and seek the aid of Lord Hood and the blockading British fleet, his patients were now of many nationalities. Though a trained surgeon, and highly regarded by his peers, Heinrich Lutyens had not forsaken a good London practice for this kind of labour. He had come to sea with a purpose, namely to examine men in a confined and stressful occupation, and to note how they reacted to the various strains placed upon them. This with the aim of producing a treatise on the way the tension of such an occupation affected those exposed. As the siege progressed, from being relatively empty, his hospital had filled up as the endless artillery duels and the frequent assaults took their toll on the defenders, leaving him little time for leisure, and even less time for the project closest to his heart. Here he was surrounded by cases with serious wounds, in a hospital full of souls well worth intimate and detailed examination, but he was too busy to note down even the observations he was being gifted. Emily Barclay, providing palliative care to those on whom he had operated, worked almost as hard as he did, and Lutyens was pleased to note that she was sharp-witted enough to absorb lessons from the treatment she was administering, and so to move from being merely a nurse providing comfort to a useful member of the hospital. He did, when his work allowed, watch her carefully, knowing that behind that bustling and busy exterior, and with a smile, youth and beauty enough to console the most distressed soul, lay a troubled heart and mind. Though she had never truly been an open book, he knew she'd come to have doubts about her marriage, reservations about the actions of her husband, and at other times a sense that she had betrayed both him and the vows she had taken. Although not present when Rear Admiral Parker visited her, Lutyens could guess at the nature of the conversation, not least because so elevated and busy an officer could not have called uninvited. Emily Barclay must have requested he do so. No doubt she had told Parker the same as that which had been imparted to both him and John Pearce, that her husband had blatantly taken part in a conspiracy to have himself exonerated of the charge of false impressment, in the process causing others to utter false testimony and commit perjury, as had he. This while Pearce and his pelicans were sent, by order of Admiral Hotham, on a mission to the Bay of Biscay, thus avoiding the court hearing their damning testimony. Yet each evening she was obliged to return to the frigate on which they both resided, battle damage now repaired, berthed in the inner harbour of Toulon, to share the same main cabin as her husband. That had to be a sore trial, only relieved by her early attendance each morning as a boat from the ship delivered her back to her hospital duties. Even if time had allowed it, Emily would not have been fully open about the pain she was experiencing. That she kept bottled up, leaving Lutyens to wonder at the awkward atmosphere which must attend on any time husband and wife spent together. With the sun beginning to sink and his sawing, sewing and cutting done, Lutyens was doing his rounds, checking on wounds from muskets, bayonets, cannon fire, and mere accidents, failing to register that the latest artillery exchanges had ceased, and he was still preoccupied when a boat bearing Lieutenant John Pearce and a dozen wounded sailors tied up at the hospital jetty. What brought him outdoors was the screams as those most serious were lifted bodily from the thwarts, and that had him heading for the doorway to supervise the placing of such casualties in what had become an extremely overcrowded infirmary. "John Pearce, it is you!" Lutyens exclaimed, peering at the smoke-blackened figure in the hallway. "It is, and sadly bringing you more trade for those knives and saws." Lutyens peered at him. "You are not hurt?" "The odd singe, but nothing more." Those same screams had brought Emily Barclay to the hallway door, yet she hesitated when she heard the voice of John Pearce, though not sure why. There was, of course, a reluctance to be reminded of the admission she had made to him, the fact that she had personally witnessed lies being told at her husband's court-martial. There was also the memory of the discomfort it had caused. But there was something else, and she knew that also to be true. The man disturbed her, always had, almost from the very first moment she had clapped eyes on him as he came aboard her husband's ship on that cold grey morning off Sheerness, a bruised and battered specimen of a pressed seaman, yet one who in his proud bearing had stood out from the throng of depressed humanity. The blatant way he had looked at her had caused her husband to strike him for insolence, and a subsequent exchange had seen him subjected to even more severe punishment, something to which she had publicly taken exception. In the dispute that followed, John Pearce had opened a breach between her and her husband. Yet hard as she tried, she could not fault any of his actions. All the blame, to her mind, lay elsewhere. About to turn away, the hesitation brought on by memories proved her undoing as his eye caught hers, and he smiled through blackened cheeks. "Mrs. Barclay." "Lieutenant Pearce," she replied, dropping her eyes to avoid his. He was staring at her in the most direct and unbecoming way, as he had on that very first day. Pearce was gazing at a weary face, but one still fine-looking, with wisps of hair which had escaped from under the mob cap stuck to her damp brow. Every time he saw her, he was struck by her appearance, and every time he wondered at her marriage. How could such a young and beautiful woman consent to marry a scrub like Ralph Barclay, 20 years her senior and not fit to spit on her boots? He had to forego the pleasure of staring at her as the casualties were brought in. Duty to these wounded sailors took precedence, and besides, Lutyens had already started on the surgery. Out in the Grand Rade, in clear sight of the hospital in which his wife was working, Captain Ralph Barclay paced the quarterdeck of HMS Britannia, wondering why Admiral Sir William Hotham, whose flagship this was, had so late in the day sent a peremptory order calling him away from his duties. Given he was presently stationed at Fort Malbousquet, the central bastion of the defence, and the one now at risk from that damned culverin sighted at Sans-Culotte, he had watched, through a telescope, the latter part of the artillery duel with some interest, while being able to see perfectly clearly that it was having only a very limited effect. Certainly the walls of the bastion were damaged, but not so much that they could not be repaired overnight, which meant a daily repetition of what had just occurred. Not a duty he would personally enjoy, given it was hard grind for little reward. In mentally seeking a solution, he had wondered at the use of such heavy ships with their deep hulls, which confined the areas in which they could operate. It might be best to use smaller vessels that could get closer inshore, like his own frigate, which would also enjoy the advantage of being smaller as targets. Now the gunnery had ceased, he was left to thoughts on his own problems. Could he be in some kind of trouble? He could think of no reason to be so. Indeed, he had no idea if he needed to be at all nervous of the forthcoming interview. Yet a sense of impending tribulation dogged him. It was part of his nature, and had been since the day 25 years before, when he had joined King George's navy as a tremulous midshipman, and entered upon a service that was harsh to those of tender years, and nerve-wracking to those who aged in the service. Life had not been easy for Ralph Barclay as he progressed to the rank of lieutenant, and he had spent too many years in that category, often serving with captains who had scant regard for the personal feelings of those under them, or any notion that competence, for whatever else he was, Ralph Barclay was a good sea officer, was worthy of reward. Finally, thanks to his then patron, Admiral Sir George Rodney, he had made it to master and commander, eventually being made post during the American War, and entering upon that list of captains which would see him, as long as he survived, an admiral himself one day. Yet the road still seemed hard. He was not, he reckoned, a lucky soul. Others, his fellow officers, were, and he had a great deal of difficulty in hiding his resentment of those he saw as either favoured by circumstance or interest. The likes of Nelson, to Barclay's mind a pint-sized popinjay, were forever being sent away on independent cruises which presented opportunity, perhaps a single-ship action that would warrant a gazette, at the very least a chance to take enemy prizes and earn some money. He had been obliged to fight all his life for every step of advancement. No great landed magnate or powerful politician pressed the Admiralty to favour him, nor had he, prior to the present conflict, enjoyed the kind of opportunity which elevates a man in the service. Even Rodney, the admiral to whom he had first pledged his allegiance, had died, leaving him adrift without that most necessary career factor, a senior naval sponsor. Yet that had appeared to change. On his present commission he had enjoyed some freedom from the fleet, had taken a couple of prizes which had eased his most pressing concerns over money. The other piece of good fortune he felt had fallen to him was his marriage to his young cousin Emily. Yet that, from what had been a bright beginning, now seemed to have soured. She had gone from a meek and obedient newlywed spouse, frightened to lose his good opinion, through small acts of divergence to downright opposition, and all because of a rogue who deserved more punishment than Ralph Barclay had ever been able to mete out to him. He now reckoned that he had done wrong to bring her to sea with him in the first place. Yet it had seemed the correct course of action when he was first offered his frigate. Money at home, after 5 years without a ship and on half pay, was so tight his door was forever being rapped on by unpaid traders. Aboard ship, Emily cost him nothing. At home she might, unsupervised, seriously increase his indebtedness. It was galling that as the threat of that penury had receded, so had the depth of her respect. Another part of that altered luck might be the man he was waiting to see, who had taken on the role of his new naval sponsor. Sir William Hotham had been in receipt of a favour from Ralph Barclay, and he, in his turn, had undertaken to replace the patron now deceased. He knew he could look for no favours from the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Hood, who had hated Sir George Rodney when he was alive, and had no time at all for any captain the late Admiral had favoured. Given, and it was no secret, that the fleet was riven with dissension in the structure of the command, a level of protection was no luxury, it was a necessity. There was no reason he could think of why his situation vis-à-vis Hotham should have changed. Yet, being by nature a warrior, he could not help but feel the certainty of such support as the man proffered was tenuous. Admirals could be fickle creatures, inclined to put their own interests well to the fore, with a damn to whoever got caught in the backwash when any support was missing. "Sir," said a slip of a midshipman, raising his hat, "Admiral Hotham will see you now." The boy nearly recoiled at the angry stare his request produced, which brought home to Ralph Barclay just how deep had been his brooding. Forcing himself to smile, he indicated the boy should proceed, following in his wake down the companionway to the main deck, crowded with sailors at their mess tables, set between the tightly bowsed-up cannon. Entering the spacious great cabin, Ralph Barclay was struck, as always, by the well-appointed nature of the place. Good furniture, paintings of real quality on the bulkheads, not least a Reynolds of Hotham in full-dress uniform, while the Admiral himself was just as well groomed, albeit in plainer garb. He had on the table before him a sheaf of papers, and in the middle, given he was fond of his belly, lay the usual bowl of ripe fruit.
"Captain Barclay," he said, indicating that his visitor should sit down. "Forgive me for just one moment."
Having obliged and sat opposite him, Ralph Barclay indulged in the useless pursuit of trying to read his superior's mind, struck by the inadvertent and unwelcome thought that there were those who wondered if the man had one to read. William Hotham, curiously nicknamed Hotspur, was given to long and contemplative silences, which irritated more rapid thinkers. Opinion differed on whether these ruminative interludes were brought on by deep intelligence or a telling degree of stupidity. It was in the midst of such guilty contemplation that he found himself staring into Hotham's watery blue eyes, and he fought to compose his features lest they revealed his disloyal peregrinations.
"Steward, a bottle of the Tokay. You will join me, won't you, Barclay?" "Of course, sir. Happily so." "How go things at Malbusque?" "It is, as you know, a warm station, sir, and getting warmer. I'm working hard to improve the outworks, but it is difficult when we are under barrage. The French might only have one cannon that can reach us at the moment, but the disorder that can inflict is heavy when we're exposed in building." "The French seem to have found themselves an enterprising artilleryman in this Captain Bonaparte." "Is that the new fellow's name?" "Corsican, according to our spies, and damn full of himself. It seems he has good connections in Paris. One of his brothers is a deputy in their damned assembly. General Cato finds it hard to rein in his man." "Why should he do so, sir, when he seems to be able to get his gunners to move into positions bordering on the suicidal? He also seems to have no regard for his losses, either in men or cannon." "They are all mad, Barclay, every damned one of them."
That was followed by one of the Admiral's habitual silences, with Hotham looking at his bowl of fruit for half a minute.
"You observed, I take it, this morning's action?"
"With deep interest, sir."
"And your impression?"
Ralph Barclay suddenly became wary, though he sought to hide it with a look of deep meditation. Who had given the orders for that abortive attempt to subdue Sans-Culotte? If the notion had originated with Hotham, he would not welcome being told it was probably doomed before even being attempted.
I fear something needed to be done, sir.
The fact that he left any other comment up in the air seemed to please Hotham, who spoke for him with alacrity.
Jell's idea, Barclay, and nonsense to boot. What is needed is an assault by Marines, but he insisted that gunnery be tried first. And Lord Hood agreed, Ralph Barclay growled.
This he did with some confidence, knowing how much the two disliked each other, and being well aware that no action could have been initiated without the tacit consent of the Commander-in-Chief. The nod, plus the look of perplexed wonder, confirmed he had the right of it. The conversation ceased as the bottle of pale golden wine appeared, the base wrapped in a damp cloth, while the neck seemed to sweat, which made Ralph Barclay raise his eyebrows. Clearly it had been properly chilled.
I had some ice fetched in from Genoa,
Hotham explained,
and very necessary it is. There is nothing less inspiring than warm white wine. How true, sir?
Barclay replied. He was thinking, with the supply problems of the fleet and the avaricious nature of the Genoese merchants, that ice was far from a necessary commodity. Hotham raised his glass, and Barclay did likewise, with the Admiral now grinning, a most unusual thing, given he was a man addicted to sang-froid.
I have the good fortune, Captain Barclay, to be the conduit of some good news.
Indeed, sir.
And it is you who will be in receipt of it.
Pearce is dead, he thought. He knew the bastard had been sent into action on those pontoons, just as he suspected Hotham had a hand in engineering it. With him gone, so many of the matters presently bearing down on him would be resolved.
You will not know that Captain Frost of Leander has asked to be relieved due to ill health.
There was a terrible temptation then to indulge in levity and ask if Frost had been stung by some insect, given he spent his entire life collecting specimens, butterflies and bugs, often at the neglect of his duties.
No, sir. Then you will also not know that it is my intention to recommend to Lord Hood that you should replace him.
Sir, Ralph Barclay could not speak. A 74-gun ship of the line. This was elevation indeed. In fact, he would be leapfrogging several officers with a better claim to the commission than he, men ahead of him on the captain's list. There would be much gnashing of teeth when the news got out, and no doubt written complaints.
Drink your wine, sir, Hotham explained, and let us toast your future. I will have your orders drawn up shortly, and once Lord Hood has confirmed my choice, you may shift your dunnage.
The glass was near to the Barclay lips as he asked,
You are sure he will agree, sir? I am.
Well, then, sir, it is my duty,
not only to toast my good fortune, but to wish you joy of your continued employment of your flag. Have no worries on that score, Barclay,
Hotham replied, his eyes narrowing.
I have enough support in London to deal with any threats to my position.
Both glasses were drained and refilled, with Ralph Barclay imagining himself in a cabin nearly as spacious as the one in which he was sitting. That brought on the worry of furnishing such an area, until he recalled that the port of Toulon was full of Provençal refugees, especially the wealthy citizens of Marseille, who had been forced to run from the terror of the Revolution when General Carteau and his ragtag army had taken the city. They were now selling everything they possessed, furniture and paintings included, at knockdown prices, just to pay for the food they needed to keep them alive. There was another thing to please him. For the first time in his life, he could probably consider his credit to be sound. True, his prizes had not yet been bought in or valued, and the amounts to be paid settled. That task still lay with his prize agents, Omani and Druce. Now their tune would have changed from the start of the year when he had first got his frigate. The two sleek and overfed partners had treated him with short shrift when he tried to get them to advance him some credit. Now, should he turn up at their chambers in the Strand, they would fetch out the best claret and treat him with the consideration due to a man lining their greedy pockets. Ralph Barclay checked himself then. He had allowed his mind to wander, and Hottam's next words brought him down with a bump.
"There are, of course, other things to consider, Captain Barclay." "Sir?" "I sent Lord Hood the papers on your court-martial 2 weeks ago, but he is yet to confirm the findings."
John Pearce's name hung like Banquo's ghost over the table, but Ralph Barclay was damned if he was going to be the one to mention it. As it turned out, Hottam was equally reluctant, though. As he referred to him in the abstract, he did so in a low tone.
"There is also a rumour that a certain party wishes to bring an action for perjury against you."
Dying to ask if there had been any news of casualties in that day's action, the word perjury passed Barclay by, until he realized that probably, if there had, Hottam would not yet know, which made stupid his previous euphoria at the thought of Pearce dead, so his reply was absent-minded.
"I think that a certain person would be better to attend to his duties, sir." "I shall ensure that he does, Captain Barclay, and I can assure you it will be warm. But now I wish you to put your mind to other matters. Given that what Admiral Gell attempted this morning has so spectacularly failed, what would you suggest we do about that damned battery?"
The thoughts he had been harbouring on deck floated into his mind, but given what had gone before, he decided they should remain there. Needing to please this man, what followed was no more than a good, if educated, guess.
"You have already alluded to it, sir. There's only one thing to do. It must be attacked and destroyed, but not by cannon fire."
Hottam was nodding, creating a relieved Ralph Barclay, who knew he had guessed right, though the game had to be played out.
"An assault with troops, in other words?" "Precisely. I take it, Captain Barclay, that in suggesting such a course you would give due consideration to the fact that in terms of losses it could be costly."
"I would, sir, but I would also give consideration to the cost of doing nothing. Fort Malbousquet is already suffering from bombardment.
Mulgrave likewise. If this Bonaparte fellow you mentioned can advance another battery into a more forward position, and then be able to employ his 24-pounders on Malbousquet, matters could become critical. I know he risks losses of his own, and serious ones, but I've already alluded to his lack of concern for human life." "I made the very point to Lord Hood when we discussed matters. He was reluctant to sanction such an assault." "He may well reconsider now, sir."
Another half a minute passed in silence before Hottam said,
"Boats and marines, yes?"
"At dawn, sir, with the sun coming from the east behind them, but supported by a land assault as well, perhaps from Fort Mulgrave."
"A night attack is a possibility. Whatever, it would require bold leadership, would it not, Barclay, and officers willing to risk all."
A third glass of wine on the way to his mouth, Ralph Barclay again stopped, for it was obvious, though again no name was used, what Hottam was driving at. The image of John Pearce leading a charge across a cloying, sandy beach was a pleasing one, but not as agreeable as the next vision he conjured up, of that same fellow drowning in a pool of his own blood.
"An officer could decline the duty, sir." "Oh, I think not, Barclay, when we are dealing with a fellow much attached to certain people. I would suggest that as well as marines, the assault would require a body of tars to spike the guns. Some, for instance, may come from your present command, others from the seamen presently serving on HMS Pharaon."
"An excellent notion, sir. Very wise, if I may say so." One of the virtues of dealing with Sir William Hottam was the fact that, given as he was to long silences, it was possible to think ahead of him. Yet the notion Ralph Barclay was cogitating on now was not entirely cheerful. He was asking himself why Hottam was favouring him with HMS Leander, when he had other captains attached to his flag with as good a claim to his favour. In fact, in at least 3 cases he knew of, a much better one. It occurred to him that Pearce might be the reason. Lord Hood had not confirmed the decision of his court. Was that a worry to the man who had set it up? It was Hotham who had sent away Pearce and his pelicans as part of the escort for those revolutionary sailors. His secretaries who had taken the potentially damning depositions never introduced at the trial, while he had ensured that the man appointed as prosecutor was not only incompetent, but one well disposed towards any captain accused of pressing seamen. Hotham came out of his reverie and spoke.
First, we must get Lord Hood to agree the necessity. I doubt he will cavil if I offer to oversee the action. Naturally, it will also be my duty to appoint the officers to both lead and execute it.
Looking into that bland face and those watery blue eyes, Ralph Barclay experienced a sudden feeling of alarm. Was he setting him up, with this proposed promotion, to lead the attack? Now he was unsure if John Pearce was the only person Hotham wanted rid of. Had he had sight of the note Parker had sent over that morning, presently nestling in Hotham's coat pocket, he would have been even more concerned. Chapter 4. The jolly boat came at the appointed hour to take Emily Barclay back to HMS Brilliant, her floating home, with, as usual, young Martin Dent talking the whole way across the anchorage. Looking into his bright eyes and open, cheerful countenance, albeit with a crooked nose, she experienced a pang of jealousy for a lad, not much younger than she, who seemed to enjoy such a carefree existence. At one time, she was of a like nature. Reprising events these last few months, it seemed as though the world had closed in around her. How distant home life now seemed, how far off the days when her major worry was how to persuade her financially constrained parents of the absolute necessity of a visit to the dressmaker. Perhaps her cares dated from the day it was made plain that her distant relation, Ralph Barclay, might make a suitable husband. That was something which could not have been mooted had he not mentioned the possibility to her father, who, no doubt, in turn, consulted her mother. How subtly it had been done. The insinuation into the proposal, the fact that the house in which they all lived was entailed to the Barclay family, and since the parent had passed on, the rather severe-looking naval captain now had the right to claim the place as part of his inheritance. In short, if enforced, the family would be homeless. Matters were not pressed. She was, after all, a mere 16 years old. But Ralph Barclay became a frequent visitor, and on closer acquaintance his rather austere manner thawed. It was also made plain, and not only by her immediate family, that a naval captain, even one presently without a ship, was a decent catch for a girl with few prospects, given her parents' dearth of means, while a husband of mature years was more likely to be and remain besotted, unlike callow youth, which was deemed capricious. Water wears away the hardest stone, and Emily was, she now realized, far from granite in her reluctance. Time made what seemed mildly unpalatable, possibly acceptable, until the point was reached where to turn down the actual proposal, an awkward moment for both parties, seemed to smack of ingratitude. From there matters had proceeded to the nuptials with seeming inevitability. "Ahoy, Mr. Pearce!" called Martin Dent, as a racing cutter manned by many more oars overhauled them. Emily was lost in memory, and besides, facing forward, she had no idea in the busy part of the bay that they were being overtaken. For the second time in as many hours the name jolted her, and she turned to see the named individual sat in the same place as she, by the stern. "Ahoy, Martin!" Pearce called back. "How's my favourite rogue?" "You been in the wars, Mr. Pearce? You looks like a blackamoor." Emily saw more than one face pinch at the way Martin was addressing John Pearce, who might have at one time been a lower-deck shipmate, but was now a man of rank. Yet she only had to look at Martin to see in his eyes a sort of happy hero-worship, which again induced a burst of memory, this time truly unpleasant. It was Martin Dent's blathering, in this very boat, which had first alerted her to certain discrepancies in the stories she had been told both by her husband and her nephew. Abreast and passing, Pearce raised his hat, to show a clean white forehead and a healthy head of hair,
She, in turn, was obliged to nod in response. "I wish he was back aboard. Brilliant, Mrs. Barclay, don't you?"
"Belay that, you stupid little bugger,"
a quiet voice growled from behind his back, which startled Emily. She had never wondered what the crew of her husband's ship knew of things. Now she was forced to consider they might be aware of more than was comfortable. Approaching the frigate, she was struck at how obvious still, new paint notwithstanding, were those parts of the upper works so recently repaired, for the ship had suffered severely in the action that saw her brought in as a French prize. Lord Hood had ordered her to be kept where she lay, in the inner harbour, within easy range of the town quays, the arsenal, and those buildings that operated as the headquarters of the French Admiralty. Should matters go awry, HMS Brilliant was in a good position, with her upper-deck guns, to subdue any hint of backsliding by the French Navy, or trouble from the Toulonnais. Emily was put ashore on the quay, with only a short walk to the gangplank that led up to the main deck, but that provided enough time for Midshipman Toby Burns to make himself scarce. He had no desire to come face to face with his aunt, who would, if she bothered to grace him with a word at all, want to berate him for his conduct at the recent court-martial. Standing on the poop by the taffrail, looking determinedly astern, he was, not for the first time in his life, indulging in a bout of self-pity. Toby Burns, as all young boys do, had dreamt of a life afloat, of exciting adventures and heroism, only to find the reality so different as to make him hate the whole notion. Capricious superiors were bad enough. Worse still were his fellow midshipmen, horrible, thieving, and given to salacious promises that scared him witless. The ordinary tars he was in fear of, ruffians to a man in his way of thinking, and always looking for ways to undermine what little authority he possessed. "Mr. Burns, you are absent from your place of duty." Sorry, Mr. Glaister," Burns cried, hurrying back to the quarterdeck, saluting the Premier with a raised hat, but taking care to avoid the glare emanating from the First Lieutenant's icy blue eyes. These were set in a bony face seemingly devoid of spare flesh, the forehead prominent. The voice, too, was harsh, not in the least softened by the man's Highland lilt. "An anchor watch is yet a watch, Mr. Burns." "Aye, aye, sir." "Then attend to it properly." With the captain mainly away at Fort Malbousquet, Glaister was in charge of the ship, and since Ralph Barclay had taken with him a goodly proportion of the crew, the other mids, and officers, it fell to Toby Burns to do much of this sort of duty, which consisted of no more than the appearance of some authority on the ship's deck. It was boring in the extreme, for little of interest happened once he got tired of watching the distant fall of shot in the endless artillery duels taking place around the bay. Those men still aboard tended to stay below when not required, a body coming up occasionally to ring the ship's bell on the hour before turning over the sand-glass. Dull it might be, but Toby Burns was content with the duty. Better that than to be under the basilisk eye of his uncle by marriage, as well as the cannon fire he would be exposed to. Even after he had lied for him in the most outrageous way, Ralph Barclay had shown little appreciation, not, it seemed, in the least aware that in doing so the boy had forfeited the regard of his Aunt Emily, the only person aboard who had treated him with kindness since the day he joined this ship. Entering the main cabin, Emily was annoyed to see the clerk, Cornelius Gerson, sitting at her husband's table, a place which had been expressly forbidden him on her request. Immediately he stood and began to gather his papers, favouring her, as he always did, with a condescending smile that made her flesh creep. "Forgive me, Mrs. Barclay. I did not expect you back so soon." "Then you have lost your sense of time, sir, for I generally return at around this hour." The smile remained, seeming, if anything, more patronising. "Then I plead the interests of your husband as excuse, ma'am." "Where is Shenton?" she demanded. Gerson seemed mildly surprised by the question, but his answer was pat. "At the markets, Mrs. Barclay." "At this hour?" "It is when the best bargains are to be had. Traders generally lower the prices when they wish to shift their wares instead of taking them home." She wanted to point out that what would be left in a town under siege
would hardly be worth having, and she also suspected there was more to the steward's absence. If there was, she could neither ask nor demand to be told. Gerson worked for her husband, not her. He was by the door when he said, "If I may say so, Mrs. Barclay, I wonder if you are doing too much. You look fatigued." "I am perfectly well, Gerson." "Thanks, no doubt, to a robust constitution." He was gone before she could snap at him, and that was just as well. The atmosphere in the cabin was generally cold enough without her making it more so. Suddenly Gerson was there again, holding a folded letter. "I forgot, Mrs. Barclay. This note came from Admiral Parker." "But Parker?" she replied, flustered. "Yes. The messenger made sure I understood it was to be given to you personally." Emily looked at the seal as soon as it was in her hand, then at him, and there was on his face a smile of a different kind, which brought to her mind the word smug. The soft whistling sound that came from beyond the cabin door as he shut it behind him did nothing to reassure her, and she looked at the seal with close attention until she was satisfied it was intact. In the cramped, tiny cabin in which he was supposed to work, Cornelius Gerson fingered the palette knife with which, once heated over tallow, he had opened that note. He had not imparted the other bit of the messenger's information, and he had been made immensely curious to hear that the Admiral had penned the note in his own hand, which implied a deep secret. Opening letters not addressed to him had been a skill early acquired. Cornelius Gerson had always felt from his first days in service the need to know what was going on in the life of his employer, and Ralph Barclay was no different. That it had got him tossed off London Bridge by one fellow for whom he had worked, who took great exception to being both cuckolded and robbed, to end up pressed as a seaman, did nothing to dent old habits. For that memory was buried under the thick carapace of his narcissism. How could he use what he had read? Would it be better to tell the captain of his wife's betrayal? Or could he use it on her? He had harboured a desire to seduce Emily Barclay on first sight, and had tried charming her. She was, after all, a beautiful woman married to a much older man, a dour bugger, while he was acknowledged by all to be a handsome fellow who had enjoyed great success with the ladies. He was still smarting from the callous way he had been rebuffed, so much so that his abiding thought was retribution. Yet the idea of bedding her had not died. Could he gain the same end by a little judicious blackmail? Who knew how far she might go to keep such a thing secret? Emily read Parker's note with increasing gloom. It was one thing to pass on verbally what she had witnessed at her husband's court-martial, quite another to put pen to paper and list the lies spoken. He had, of course, reminded her that she could not testify against her husband, so the written words were for information only. Yet, that being true, what purpose were they designed to serve? A man as senior as Parker must have a reason, but if he had, there was no mention of what it might be in his wording. For a moment she deeply regretted being too open with him, and had the same feeling about the way she had previously gone to John Pearce and, in the presence of Heinrich Lutjens, told them both what had happened. Meant only for information, matters had spiralled out of control. The thought of a trial for perjury had never entered her head until Pearce proclaimed it as his intention. And that growling voice in the jolly boat telling Martin Dent to shut up, what did that mean? Keeping secrets on board ship, she had soon discovered, was a near impossibility, so her fractured relationship with her husband would be no mystery. Added to that, every man-jack aboard would know the court-martial evidence to be a tissue of lies. Not that they would say so, for if tars were endemically curious, they were also very tight-lipped and protective of their ship. Taking up her quill, she penned a quick reply to Admiral Parker, declining his invitation to commit anything to paper. Sanded, folded, and sealed, she was contemplating the notion of Shenton delivering it when she made an abrupt decision. Her husband's steward could not be trusted, neither could Gerson. It would set tongues wagging no end, but she went out onto the deck and asked if Martin Dent was free to come to the main cabin.
In the 5 minutes which passed before he arrived, she nearly changed her mind and tore up the reply, and when he came in, the look on the boy's face was not one to reassure her. He was not the cheeky scamp now. Indeed, he looked, as he whipped off his cap, very worried. "Martin," she said, "I am allowed to call you that, I think?" He touched his forelock. "You are, ma'am." "Could I ask you to come a little closer?" On the other side of the door, Cornelius Gerson was shocked. Surely she was not going to debauch the boy. That only lasted a second before he recovered himself and castigated his own habit of seeing something sensational in what had to be innocuous. It was galling, though, that he could no longer clearly hear what was being said. "I wish you to carry out an errand for me, Martin," Emily murmured into an ear now no more than a foot from her mouth. "I want you to take a note to the flagship of Lord Hood and give it into the hand of Admiral Hyde Parker. There are boats going to and from Victory all the time, and you will surely have little trouble getting transport in one." "That would mean me going off the ship, ma'am, and for that I'd need the permission of the captain." If Martin saw how that notion flustered her, he did not react. "Could not Mr. Glaister give you that in my husband's absence?" "He could, ma'am, but I would be afeard to propose it to him." "No doubt he would oblige if I asked." "Reckon he would, ma'am," the youngster replied after a significant pause. "Wait here, Martin," Emily said, sweeping past him and going out of the door. As her footsteps receded, they were replaced with the head of Cornelius Gerson, skipping back from the hutch into which he had hurriedly retreated, his straw-blonde hair flopping forward and his girlish face bearing a genial look. "Why, Martin Dent, how do you fare?" Martin did not like Gerson. Indeed, he thought there were few souls born who did, he being what was termed a treacherous sod. He had been pressed into the frigate at the same time as Pearce and his mates, though no man could be said to differ more. Martin had hated Pearce to start with, for his ill-formed nose was a direct result of a punch from that source. Yet the man had turned out to be a gem of a fellow, unlike the bugger now grinning at him. "I's all right, Corny. And how are you?" The face closed up. Gerson hated that nickname, but he fought to look pleasant again. "What's afoot with the captain's lady?" "Nought." "Must be something, Martin, you being called to the cabin? First time you've been in here, I would guess." "Happen," Martin replied, using the back of his hand to wipe his nose. "So, are you going to enlighten an old shipmate?" "You ain't no shipmate of mine, Corny, with your fancy togs and airs, and in truth, I don't think you ever was." Cornelius Gerson's face went from pretty to downright spiteful. "While you turned out to be Pearce's little playmate." Martin Dent spat back at him. "Watch your tongue, bastard, or you'll get a clout with a marlin spike one dark night." "I'm shaking in my shoes." The head disappeared. Obviously, by the crash of the Marine sentry's boots, he had heard the imminent return of Emily Barclay, for she appeared moments later, approaching close again and speaking softly. "Martin, Mr. Glaister has agreed that you may leave the ship." "Ma'am?" "He may inquire of you what you were asked to do. It would be doing me a service if that was kept to yourself." "I dunno as I can do that if the Premier demands to know." Emily was thinking hard. She could mention John Pearce, for she had the impression that young Martin would do anything for him, but that would open up a can of worms. So she decided to take the same line as she had with Glaister. "The matter relates to something the Admiral wants to do for my husband." Hang the bugger, thought Martin, for what had happened at the court-martial was common gossip. "He wants it to be a surprise, which is why I asked for you. To request that either Shenton or Gerson carry out this task would put them in an invidious position." What, ma'am?" "Sorry, false is a better word." Martin had another thought then, that it was a good word to apply to that pair. Emily put up her hand and asked him to be still while she went into one of the side cabins, a sleeping place Martin saw through the open door, with a swinging cot and a sea-chest. With her back to him, he did not see her extract a coin from her chest, but it was clutched in her hand when she returned. "Martin, I want you to take this as a reward." Their hands met, and he looked down to see gold, 1/2 guinea, and he knew without being told that this was no reward for the errand, but the price of his silence. He also knew questions would be asked about what was afoot, and not only by the likes of Gerson. Every one of his shipmates would be at him. Emily was watching him closely, and could see in his face the confusion as he held out the coin to her. "Best I don't take this, ma'am, though it is kindly meant, I's sure." "Why, Martin?" she asked softly. "Not a soul aboard will trouble me for an answer in just doing such an errand," he lied. "But if they sniff I was paid a reward, they'll be at me for a reason like hounds after a hare." "Surely they will only know if you tell them." Martin grinned, and that lifted Emily's heart, for it was more like the cheerful lad she knew, the one who never stopped talking as he worked his oar. "You don't know much about SARS, ma'am. They's got eyes in the back of their heads, and as like as not gold would be spotted before I could get it into me dunnage. And if I get set to spend this, and there'd be little point in owning it other, I'll get no end of inquiry, leastways till they forget all about this day." "Then, Martin, would you permit me to keep it for you, to claim whenever you like?" Martin Dent liked Emily Barclay, and was much given to speculate, like everyone else aboard HMS Brilliant, what she was doing wed to a sourpuss old goat like Ralph Barclay. He also guessed she had a soft spot for John Pearce, which she had made plain when he was up to be punished. Anybody who had a good opinion of him was all right as far as Martin Dent was concerned. Christ, the man had saved his life, and even although Martin had done his best to see the bugger off at the very start of this commission by trying to drop a heavy block on his head, he had found himself easily forgiven. "It'd be a bit like saving, then." "Just that, Martin. I never had naught saved before. Allus spent whatever I had first chance." Emily put the note in his hand. "For the Admiral, personally." "Don't you fret, ma'am. I'll see to it, and—" He put his finger to the side of his broken nose. "Not a soul will get out of me anything, I promise." She wanted to kiss his cheek then, but that would be going too far. As Martin passed the canvas screen that shielded Gerson's hutch, he saw through the gap that the clerk was in deep conversation with Shenton, the captain's steward, bent over a piece of paper both men were studying. Barefoot, they would not have heard him on the deck planking, so he stopped to listen. They were speaking so quietly it was hard to make out anything but the odd word, but he did hear clearly cable, canvas and powder, along with some reference to a contact at the arsenal. Chapter 5. "Ain't natural," insisted Rufus Dommett, as he watched John Pearce energetically stroke his way through the sea-water before he took a deep breath and went under. "If God had intended man to swim, he would have favoured him with gills." "I wish I had a shilling piece for every time you've said that, Rufus." Rufus looked at Charlie Taverner with something approaching surprise, for he was sure he had never said anything of the like before. But he did not argue. Charlie had a habit of being right, and an even more annoying one of being convincing even when he was in the wrong. Pearce's head came up right beside the boat, lashed to the side of HMS Pharaon, and with one heave he lifted himself clear of the sea and threw a leg over the gunwale, balancing there until Charlie grabbed him and helped him over the rest. "Obliged, Charlie," Pearce gasped, shaking his head and covering his helper in water. "Well, I see I has no need to go a-dipping. All I has to do is wait till you comes back inboard." "The tribulations of being a servant, Charlie." "I reckon I's supposed to be thankful and all." Taking a towel off Rufus, he grinned at Charlie, who was looking a damn sight more querulous than he truly was. "At least, with me as your master, you can curse me at will." Michael O'Hagan's head came over the ship's side. "Mr. Harbin has sent to say dinner is about to be served, and since the captain is invited, you might like to shift." "Ask him for time to change my breeches. I can hardly sit down to eat soaking wet." "Then move, John boy, for sure I am as sharp-set as ever I was, and thanks to me partaking of this servant-in-lark, my dinner is waiting also." Pearce was mock serious as his head came level with that of the Irishman.
One of these days I must experiment with flogging to see if I can gain a little respect. How many lashes would a bugger off earn? Round the fleet, Michael, at least.
Looking past O'Hagan as he was helped over the bulwark, Pearce saw Henry Digby pacing the tiny quarterdeck, clearly in range of that exchange, but studiously looking at some distant object. On a small deck it was hard to be out of earshot, and often necessary to pretend otherwise.
"Digby's behind you," Pearce whispered.
Michael winked and responded in an overly solicitous tone.
"Ease yourself over, your honour, and mind your jewels. We would not want you unmanned by a splinter, now would we?"
Henry Digby tried, but his shoulders began to shake. He knew well the close relationship Pearce had with these men, and the depth of it had been made plain on the journey to the Bay of Biscay and back. When it came to risk and danger, and there had been enough for any man in La Rochelle, Pearce was like a magnet, yet he had these men loyal enough to follow him anywhere. Discipline was one thing, and they all had a care to pretend it was as formal as it was supposed to be when he was nearby, but O'Hagan was larding the solicitations, and it was too amusing not to react.
"Forgive me, sir," Pearce called to him. "I spent too much time in the sea." "Accepted, Mr. Pearce, but I should be more worried about Mr. Harbin's approbation than mine."
"Now you be after coming along, your honour," said Michael, still in that unctuous and lilting Irish voice, while leading a laughing John Pearce aft.
"And me and your other boyos will see you dressed and fit for decent company in a trice."
End of CD 2. CD 3.
To call the cramped space in which they were eating a wardroom was to gild matters. HMS Pharaon, so recently captured from the French, was not a large vessel, and if there was any comfort aboard, it was for the captain to enjoy. Having originally brought the prize into Toulon, Pearce had occupied a similar cabin aboard the ship which had captured the one he now served on, and sitting here now he was reminded how much he missed the luxury of space and solitude. As living and sleeping quarters, the wardroom was shared between Pearce, Midshipman Harbin, and the elderly master, Mr. Neame, and so small that it required their sea chests to be moved out to accommodate a board large enough for 4 to be seated. The oil lamps were too close, making the whole space excessively warm on a balmy night, and naval convention did not allow for the removal of their heavy broadcloth coats, leaving John Pearce to contemplate another cooling dip in the sea. Harbin found it difficult to relax, his young face throughout the meal creased in worry, for he had been given the task of overseeing the ingredients and preparation, how the courses would be served, and what wines would accompany them, albeit he was spared any personal expense, a trial to a youngster given the responsibility for the first time. Digby had taken it upon himself, while he was in temporary command of both this vessel and the Mid, to ensure the youngster learnt not only proper manners, but also how to act as a host. When the cloth was drawn and the port decanter produced, happily for him, Harbin's guests pronounced themselves well satisfied. As was normal after any dinner, the adults fell to discussion, the shared memory of all being the recent voyage to and from the Bay of Biscay, and they commonly wondered at the fate of those 5,000 French sailors they had returned to near their home ports, but particularly the officers Pearce had saved from the guillotine. Had they made it home? Did they still have their heads on their shoulders?
"A toast to them all!"
boomed Neame, who was much given to downing bumpers in such a fashion. The red in his countenance was not all from the warmth of the cabin.
"And damnation," Pearce added, "to the curs who sent me away so they could rig their court."
Digby frowned at that, a clear indication he regretted mention of the subject, even if he was obliged to respond, being of the opinion Pearce was ramming his head against a brick wall. He would struggle to bring a case, never mind win it. The Navy would close ranks to protect its own. Disapproval notwithstanding, Pearce was not to be deflected when Digby outlined the all-too-obvious problems.
"But I must try. I don't think you understand the depth of my attachment to these men.
If it is a brick wall, I must see it demolished. By taking them on as servants, I have at least made it hard for those who see me as trouble to send them where they like." "I hardly need remind you, Mr. Pearce," Digby responded, "of the temporary nature of my command. There are any number of officers ahead of me on the lieutenant's list serving ashore, and I suspect they eye our ship with envy coupled with hope. I expect to be shifted any day, and should we all be ordered to transfer to other vessels, it could well include the break-up of the crew. You might struggle to hold on to them."
"I won't if Ralph Barclay has his way." "It is not a sound notion to let your hatred of that man consume you," said Neame.
"Am I allowed a word, sir?" asked Harbin.
"Speak up, young fellow," cried Digby. "Are we not obliged to educate you in all things, including the art of conversation?"
"Well, I had words with Fairmillow." Harbin stopped then, because the look in John Pearce's eye was not one to encourage him to continue. Midshipman Fairmillow, seconded from HMS Brilliant, had been one of a number of souls who had sailed with them to the Bay of Biscay, shifted out of the way because, as in his case, they had either been present the night the Pelicans had been pressed, or were too likely to speak the truth if called to testify. "Go on, Mr. Harbin," Pearce insisted, curious as to what the lad had been told. "He did say you put up a hell of a fight, sir." Pearce smiled at the recollection, though nothing of that cold and windy winter night could truly be said to have been amusing. Whatever was known about him, he doubted that many were aware he was on the run when he entered the Pelican, Michael O'Hagan being the only one he had trusted with the whole truth. He could see the Pelican in his mind's eye now. The fug of pipe smoke, the heat of blazing fires, and the crowds of people taking their ease in a place they thought free from the fear of intrusion. What had these people known of Adam Pearce, or of radical thinkers in general? Of King's Bench warrants, writs for seditious libel of the kind from which he and his father had been forced to flee? Those he was sitting with now were no different. Harbin was like Henry Digby, happy in the certainty that England was the land of liberty. Maybe it was for them, but it had not been that for Pearce, père et fils. They had been hounded for his father's beliefs, notions like a fairer distribution of wealth and land, education for the lower orders, and the kind of universal suffrage, women included, that would see an end to rotten boroughs and a parliamentary system dominated by men, landed interests, city money, and an interfering monarch. It was easier to talk about the Paris to which they had fled, though a jaundiced eye would be raised at his tales of a city in the grip of a joyous, new-found freedom. It had been that, when they arrived, to be heartily welcomed in a place where Adam Pearce's reputation and ideas had preceded him. To a radical mind, the Edinburgh ranter was a hero. It turned out to be a false dawn. His father would no more bow the knee to a Jacobin than a prince, and neither took kindly to those who pointed out their failings. Inexorably, Paris became less safe than London, so, with his father ailing and in trouble, son John had returned to try and get the sanction on them lifted. What he got was a pursuit that saw him take refuge in the Pelican. "I did put up a fight, Mr. Harbin, but to no avail, though I broke the nose of someone close to the same age as you. Hardly heroic, wouldn't you say?" "I would say it depends, sir. I believe the lad you mentioned got in your way, and a few others were bruised trying to restrain you." "Mr. Fairmillow has a good memory." "He was right scared of you, sir." "Mr. Harbin." Pearce held up his hand to interrupt Digby. The boy was only speaking the truth, for Midshipman Fairmillow had stayed well out of his way on the journey to Biscay, though he hoped he had put his fear to rest when he took him ashore at La Rochelle. It was a pity for the boy that what they had done there must remain secret. Had it been made public, it could only have aided his future career. No doubt he and Harbin had talked much on that subject, too. "I imagine you were not the only one aboard who was curious." "No, sir. The whole crew wanted chapter and verse of what happened in the Liberties, but your lads would not oblige." Neame spoke up again. "Whatever occurred that night, it has led you into some adventure, has it not, Mr. Pearce?" Harbin was looking at him eagerly.
Sailors, and age had no bearing on this, loved listening to tales as much as they loved the telling, and pure truth was often the first victim of exaggeration. Given encouragement, the boy would want to know every detail of the affair in Brittany, all about the battle at sea, which had resulted in his being commissioned by the direct command of King George. There was, however, one flaw in satisfying the boy's curiosity. He could not do so without sounding boastful, and that was anathema. "Have we not all had adventures? Why, Mr. Harbin, I'll wager every mid in the fleet is jealous of you for Porto Vecchio." That started Neame off, for Henry Digby had not been with them on the voyage round Corsica, and the events at Porto Vecchio had been singular, leading to sudden death as well as the taking of the very ship on which they were conversing. Neame had saved the day, and he was not about to let pass an opportunity to tell even those who had been present of his deeds. When they moved on to talking about the action off La Rochelle, it was, as a wholly shared experience, more wonder at the luck they had enjoyed than gloat at the outcome. John Pearce was well satisfied. The conversation had moved on from him and his past. Martin Dent, idling on the main deck of HMS Victory, waiting for a boat to take him back ashore, was much taken with the ceremony attending a visiting admiral, something he had never witnessed. First was the commotion that followed on from the news of the approach of this elevated personage, the rush of officers hurriedly donning their best uniform coats and hats to line up by the entry port. This while a small party of marines were dressed in file and inspected by their harassed officer, behind whom a midshipman ensured that nothing sullied the deck. That included Martin, who was told to vacate his seat on the 24-pounder cannon and at least stand when the Admiral went by. The captain of the ship appeared to do the honours of greeting, but not until he made sure all was in order. Obliging the nervous mid, Martin was taken with the stiff formality with which they comported themselves as the boatswain sounded his call. The man who appeared, though, the second Admiral Martin had seen that day, seemed less impressive than the one called Parker, who had a bit of height and meat about him. This one seemed small and pasty-faced, and it was telling that as he greeted each officer in turn, the captain of the flagship included, there was no eye contact. Martin, who liked to look at a fellow direct on first acquaintance, put him down as likely to be a slippery bugger. Both Hood and Parker heard the commotion which attended Hotham coming aboard. They had been pre-warned at the news of his approach, the whistles and stamping of marine boots all an indication they would be pressed to finish their discussion. For much as he had little time for his second-in-command, Lord Hood could not insult him by keeping him waiting. Parker was waving the note Martin Dent had just delivered, though unwilling to tell his commanding officer from whom it had come. "I contend it matters little, sir, if we lack a written deposition. The court-martial papers stand by themselves. I urge you to hold to the course on which we decided." Hood looked hard at the note. "If I knew as much as you, perhaps I would. But lacking that, I shall not do so in a bold manner, Parker. Let's fish a little and see how Hotspur Harry responds." Hood, out of courtesy, stood as Hotham was announced. Parker did likewise because the man was his superior officer. Refreshment was offered and accepted. The necessary rituals were observed before, seated, they came to the business at hand. "I fear I was correct about the attempt on the sans-culotte battery, my lord." Parker responded. "Yet you accept it has to be kept engaged, sir." The nod and the wave of the hand were at odds with each other, more a sign of impatience than agreement. What followed was a general and pointless review of the situation, which had not changed since the day the French handed over the port. The perimeter to be held was too great for the available forces, and was getting worse. The Jacobins were being reinforced. The besieged were not receiving fresh forces at the right pace, and this was allowing the enemy to hold and keep the initiative. "In which case," Hotham said, "I refer to the memorandum I sent you prior to this visit, my renewed suggestion of a combined assault on that redoubt by both boats and land forces." "To what end, Admiral?"
Why, to destroy it, of course.
Hood was unsure if Hotham was a fool or just playing ducks and drakes in a command where he had no authority, and thus no risk of personal censure. This clown had been present when that idea had been examined and discarded. He had no end of military advice from his own top soldier, Lord Mulgrave, whom he trusted, as well as every senior officer of each nation represented. If anything, he was pressed by too many opinions, not too few.
A pretty notion, sir, but I am sure I told you before. If we cannot hold the ground, we will achieve no more than a diminution of our already stretched forces. It cannot be taken without incurring casualties, and we would likely be kicked out of the position damn quick. While it is doing damage, it is not yet a serious threat.
We might be able to hold it.
I cannot see how, sir,
Hood replied, his impatience beginning to show.
All we would do is to create an unsustainable salient and put the men required to remain there at risk of even heavier bombardment. The French method of advance means they have strong battery positions which can play on that part of the shoreline, and given they have men in abundance, how long do you think it will be before they launch a counter-attack? No. If we cannot push the enemy back from all the positions they occupy and hold them,
I fear if we just stand on the defensive, we invite the enemy to be bold.
If you will give permission for such an assault, I would be happy to execute it. Personally?
No. I have in mind that a boat attack could be led by Captain Barclay.
Hood picked up a piece of paper from the table sent over earlier by Hotham.
Whom you wish me to elevate to the command of HMS Leander.
He is, to my mind, worthy of the promotion.
Hood had to suck in his cheeks then in order to remain calm. This was his fleet, not Hotham's. He was the C&C, so he had the choice of whom to promote and whom to ignore, and he also had officers to whom he was obligated. Hotham was pushing him because of his influence in London.
"And what other officers would you suggest, sir?"
asked Parker, seeing a forthcoming explosion. That got another airy wave. If he noticed Hood was upset, it did not seem to concern him.
"There is no shortage of officers willing to carry out such a task."
"Open boats against well-sighted cannon," said Hood. "An attack across 500 yards of soft sand with a well-defended outwork to overcome. Hot work, I think. I trust Captain Barclay's game."
"I cannot believe any officer would decline to take part because it was hot."
The last emphasized word was damn cheek as far as Hood was concerned.
"If you wish to attempt an attack by boats, I will sanction it, but I will not add any land forces to aid you."
"Then the affair is useless."
Hood knew it to be far from that. Hotham had made his previous verbal and denied suggestion in writing, and that would be read by his political cronies. The man would also demand that the C&C reply in kind, so the whole thing was just a smokescreen to make him look zealous while his superior appeared tardy. In short, another stick with which to beat him. Parker was watching his chief closely. He knew his temperament was not of the kind to be toyed with, and Hotham was coming on stronger than even he thought possible, behaving as though he was invulnerable. He had thought the note he had sent over alerting him to the intentions of John Pearce might modify his behaviour. Clearly that was not the case. He saw the C&Cs swell up to respond, and while he would have phrased differently what Hood finally said, the sentiment might not have differed greatly.
"Admiral Hotham," Hood growled, "this is a fleet on service, is it not?"
The response was a nod of some condescension.
"It is not a political club."
"I fail to see,"
Hood blew then.
"You see only too well, sir. You think by undermining me to replace me."
"I protest."
"I don't give a damn, sir. Protest away."
"My lord," said Parker, with a look begging for calm. Hotham was not the only one capable of going too far.
"I do not care to be addressed in this manner,"
Hotham spluttered. Hood's voice, though it ceased to be as harsh, was, in its even, low tone, more menacing by far.
"I do not give a fig for what you care, sir. I am your superior officer, and if I choose to berate you, I have the right. You come here with a plan already dismissed with sound reasons that has no other object than to embarrass me with the government."
Hotham stood, and Hood shouted,
"Sit down, sir, and that is an order. If you disobey, I will send you home."
Hotham did not sink into the chair, he collapsed.
"What would happen if I agreed to save my face? Who would you have sent to near certain perdition along with Barclay? And what is this nonsense of promoting him into a fourth rate? Is this the same fellow who has just been reprimanded in a court-martial?"
"He's a deserving officer."
"He's a poltroon, and he will stay where he is."
"I have given my assurances."
"Then ungive them, sir. And in speaking of his court-martial, I am minded not to confirm the findings."
"You gave your word."
"I did so in the belief that I had your backing in the matter of sending home those 5,000 French seamen. Yet my correspondence from London indicates to me that you have made plain you disagreed."
I made aware some of my reservations to those who are rightly concerned."
"Which is what I will do with the findings of your court. I will keep my word and confirm the verdict, but with my reservations."
It was now Hood who stood up.
"I thank you for attending upon me, Sir William."
As a dismissal it was brutal, but as a red-faced Hotham took his hat from Hood's steward, the words that the commanding officer used next struck at his very being.
"Parker, send for Lieutenant Pearce. I have a duty for him to perform, one for which he is admirably suited, and one that has nothing to do with sacrificing himself on some fruitless assault to save another's skin."
For Parker, a penny dropped, a realization that had obviously occurred to Lord Hood before it had to him, which was wounding to an officer who thought himself more cunning than his commander. Hood had nailed the reason which had eluded him. The assault Hotham wanted to carry out would be dangerous, if not suicidal. Hotham would make sure Pearce was a part of it, maybe even Barclay as well. That note had had an effect after all. "Would I be permitted to say that was unwise, sir?" Parker said as the door was closed behind the chastened visitor. Hood seemed to deflate.
"Say what you like, Parker, but I've had enough of swaying to satisfy Billy Pitt. Let the sods replace me if they wish, and I wish them joy of Admiral Sir William Bloody Hotham."
Up at Fort Malbousquet, Ralph Barclay was supervising the digging of a deep trench, which would slow down any infantry assault on the earthworks protecting the redoubt and its cannon. But he was not really concentrating. Instead, he was imagining his new cabin, and also the possibility that his wife would see his promotion to a larger ship as vindication of his actions. Perhaps, with a new home to furnish, she would be less of a termagant. This he did while Sir William Hotham was seething and cogitating on the thwarts of his barge on how to dish Hood, and what he might have to do to protect himself. Chapter 6. HMS Fareham was at sea again, upping anchor from off Toulon at first light, once more charged with a special mission, which seemed on the very edge of the purpose for which the warship had been constructed. Digby had strict orders to keep his cannon housed, to avoid action, and to do no more than act as a support to the efforts of an extremely disgruntled John Pearce. If that man was unhappy, Henry Digby was not. As he had said at dinner, he was really too junior for command of this vessel, and had expected to be ordered out of her as soon as she returned from the Bay of Biscay. Pearce was not alone in finding the space and solitude of a captain's cabin enticing. The journey was of short duration, east to Villefranche, a town that, despite its name, was legally part of the Kingdom of Sardinia. The French armies had seized nearby Nice, and now claimed this whole area as an integral part of La Patrie. In the bay lay 2 enemy frigates,
and there were grounds to believe that those who officered them shared the same reservations about the revolution as their counterparts who had rebelled in Toulon. If they could be persuaded to raise the fleur-de-lis in like manner and sail to join Lord Hood, it would hearten the defence and deal another blow to the madman in Paris. Pearce was once more cursed with his knowledge of French, and for a second time HMS Pharaon would be required to fly a flag of truce. He had had a communication from Hood himself, another from Admiral Langara, who led the Spanish forces, plus a letter from Rear Admiral Trogoff, the French commander at Toulon. This so that the frigate captains should be in no doubt that they would be welcomed by the entire Allied command. After a long, hot summer, and no sign yet of the autumn rains, the coastline they sailed along was light brown in colour, a parched landscape with steeply rising hills behind, which appeared blue-grey in the haze of the day. Heavily forested, from time to time billowing smoke rose skywards, evidence perhaps of burning fields of stubble, or of fires which had broken out in areas of dry and combustible timber. The smell that came off the land was a combination of dry burnt earth, pine wood, and a definite hint of thyme, while, with the sun shining, the waters were deep blue. In short, an aspect to lift a man's soul. Once they had weathered Cap d'Antibes, the land faded as they held a course further out to sea. Villefranche needed to be approached from due south to avoid the ship alerting the garrison in Nice. "Well, Mr. Neame," asked a cheerful Digby, "what do we face?"
"A fine deep-water anchorage, sir, maybe the best deep bay along the whole part of this coast, barring Toulon itself, suitable for the largest vessels, provided there is not a strong incoming tide."
Ahead of them, on the slightly canted deck, John Pearce was supervising the crew at their early morning duties, swabbing, sanding, and flogging dry the deck, with the relaxed air of men not troubled by foul wind and driving rain. It was getting warm as the sun rose higher, but not yet hot, with breeze enough to sail easy, one cool enough to dry off both the planking and any hint of perspiration. Pearce might be in charge of the operation, but his mind was engaged elsewhere. Hood had not even bothered to see him. That had been left to Parker. But the message had been blunt. "Help us, and we might be persuaded to aid you." It was the might which was a worry, because Parker had made it plain what was on offer would be as a reward for services rendered. Pearce was inclined, when supping with such devils, to prefer a long spoon. Payment in advance was better than the promise of any subsequent reward. "It's perfectly simple," Pearce had said with an infuriating air of self-satisfaction. "We are informed that the French army is well to the east, on the borders of Italy, and thus in no position to interfere. The naval officers you need to see should be on their ships, and they are likely to be as disaffected as the fellows in Toulon. All you need do is give them the dispatches we will compose. There is no need to add any words of your own. I am sure you will find it as easy as kissing my hand, and it is an area in which you do have experience." Pearce had looked at Parker closely then. A great deal of what had happened at La Rochelle had not been entered in the ship's log, while every member of the Pharaon's crew had been sworn to secrecy. Had it leaked out? Was that why he was being elbowed into undertaking this mission? Parker's next words at least eased his concerns on that score. "It's no different to the mission you embarked on here before we took over Toulon." Pearce had been sent on a mission to contact the senior French officers with an offer from Hood. His first trip had proceeded smoothly. The second had not. "Might I remind you, sir, that on that occasion I came close to forfeiting my life." "You were," Parker replied unctuously, "at some risk, Lieutenant. But I doubt your life was threatened." And it is one, Pearce thought, you would surrender without turning a hair. He kept that to himself. Under Parker's hand lay the transcripts of Ralph Barclay's court-martial. That was the proposed arrangement.
Help get those 2 frigates out of Villefranche and into the harbour at Toulon, and he would be allowed to see the actual testimony each witness had given. Priceless if he was to nail the participants for perjury.
"Cap Ferrat coming up dead ahead, sir," called Nimes. "We will open the Bay of Villefranche as soon as we clear it. Mr. Harbin, see to the flag of truce."
The boy rushed to obey, and within a minute the ensign of a vice-admiral's command was lowered to be replaced with a huge expanse of billowing pure white, made large so there could be no mistaking the mission on which the ship was engaged.
"Mr. Pearce, I would suggest it is time for you to change from your working garments into your best uniform."
Weathering the low, rocky outcrop of Cap Ferrat, the depth and suitability of the bay was immediately obvious, as were the 2 fine frigates lying at double anchor under fortress guns, sails bowed up tight to the yards, while behind, fronted by a long strand of near-white sand and a small harbour full of fishing boats, stood a walled town of light brown stone. The high castle, which protected the ships, was well placed to defend the whole anchorage, and, judging by the movement, the sight of HMS Farron had brought people to the battlements. Could they be gunners? Digby had orders to do nothing to alarm any defenders. He was to stay out of range of land-based or ship's cannon, and send Pearce in by boat. Nimes brought the sloop up into the wind, backing her sails to kill any forward motion, and once stationary, the cutter was hauled in from its tow to be stepped with a stanchion bearing a smaller replica flag of truce. Michael O'Hagan was first into the boat, hiding a pair of cutlasses under the thwarts, having said loudly before they ever opened the bay that he would need to go along with John Boy, and armed, given his habit of getting into trouble. Pearce had availed himself of a canvas satchel, which he slung over his shoulder, and as soon as he clambered inelegantly down into the cutter, it was not an art he had mastered, the transfer from ship to boat on a swell. The man acting as coxswain ordered the lines to be cast off.
"Easy now, lads," Pearce said. "No haste is necessary." "Sure, it'll be grand if that be the case on our return," said O'Hagan.
Usually John Pearce took Michael's comments in good grace. Not this time. The Irishman got a cold glare. As they approached the side of the first frigate, the one bearing a Commodore's pennant, Pearce called out the name of his vessel, only realizing that with it being named after the mountain that enclosed Toulon, it might act as a red rag, especially to men who would very likely know the ship. To them, if they did recognize her, it would be by her original French name of Mariette. In order to cover that potential gaffe, he shouted, "Ahoy!" as well. "Bondine," came the reply. In French, Pearce asked for permission to close, and that was granted until, under the lee of the ship's scantlings, he found himself talking to a youngish fellow in a scruffy light blue coat, who identified himself as un sous-lieutenant de vaisseau. The bearer of the satchel was obliged to identify himself in a manner which always made him feel like a fraud, whatever language he used.
"Lieutenant John Pearce, de la Marine du Roi Britannique. Je voudrais parler avec votre capitaine, monsieur."
"Malheureusement, mon capitaine n'est pas ici." Further questioning established that both captains, of Bondine as well as the other frigate, Vestal, were living ashore, not on their ships, which, given the fact that a formidable enemy fleet was not far off, was pretty slack behaviour. But of course Villefranche was, like every bay on this part of the coast, backed by high hills, which provided good advance warning of any hostile approach. Indeed, his ship must have been spotted and reported on well before it ever weathered Cap Ferrat. Pearce explained that he had letters for those officers, and who they were from, which got him no more than a Gallic shrug. With no notion of how to proceed, he inquired when they would be likely to be aboard, only to be given a second gesture of ignorance. As this had not been anticipated, he had no option but to ask this junior lieutenant to send a message ashore, and ask if they would consent to a meeting, a request which was agreed, leaving Pearce to wonder if he should just lay off and wait, or row back and hope for some kind of signal. To just wallow here off the side of the frigate would imply a degree of nervousness, and apart from that, he had no idea of how long such a wait would be. The boat had neither water nor any other means of sustenance. They would be sat here under a hot sun with no protection, and in grave danger of the oarsmen missing their dinner. So after another brief exchange, he arranged that a signal gun should be fired as soon as someone he could talk to had come aboard. "Out of their ships, Pearce," said Digby in the cool of his cabin. This to an inferior who would dearly have liked to slip off his coat. "Of course they do things differently in the French Navy, but we would likely be keel-hauled for such a dereliction." "It does not indicate an excess of zeal." "Which makes easier your mission, does it not? I rather feared we might open the bay to find those two frigates with their guns run out and their sails set ready to engage." "And no doubt," Pearce responded in a slightly querulous tone, "you would have been obliged to send me over to parley with them regardless." "I would indeed. I have my orders." A slight boom reverberated across the anchorage, but protocol obliged Digby to wait to be told what it portended. "Mr. Harbin's compliments, sir. The frogs have just fired a signal gun." "Mr. Pearce?" Another slow trip between vessels brought him face to face with the same fellow, only to find that the officers he hoped to meet were still ashore, though there was a written invitation that he and his captain, once the Frenchman had established there was one, should meet his superiors on land, under their flag of truce. All the toing and froing had used up the day. The sun was well on its way to sinking in the west, so Pearce suggested a meeting early in the morning. "Any possibility of devilry, Mr. Pearce?" asked a worried Digby. "I cannot say it is impossible, sir, though I rate it unlikely. They would hardly come after us in the dark when they could have done so easily in the day. Besides, we are under a truce flag. I've had occasion to doubt the protection of that before. And I seem to recall it was misplaced, sir. Nevertheless, we will haul off tonight and get ourselves some sea room as a precaution." "The invitation to go ashore extends to us both," Pearce reminded him. "I know," Digby replied with a slight furrowing of the brow. "But I do not see what my presence adds to things. Let me sleep on it." John Pearce had not enjoyed his day any more than he relished his mission, and he was beginning to feel like a sacrificial lamb. This while his superior sat out in the bay ready to flee if matters went awry. "It would be a shame to jeopardize matters for an exercise of caution which may prove unnecessary, sir." Just before Digby welled up to protest at an imputation of excessive personal caution, Pearce added, "I doubt it is something Lord Hood would appreciate." Digby repeated his decision to sleep on it, but Pearce knew, in the face of that comment, he would not be going ashore alone. Sir William Hotham toyed with the hard-shelled nut in his hand, while in the other the implement designed to crack it lay idle. His mind was not, however, in the same state. In fact, if it could be said to be so in such an individual, it was agitated, and the cause was Ralph Barclay. Had he gone too far in support of the fellow and exposed himself? And how was he going to tell him that his proposed elevation to a 74-gun ship had been denied by Hood, without a loss of face? To be second in command of a fleet was enough to chafe at the soul of any man. To be inferior to a man with whom you had nothing in common was purgatory. His views, prior to the takeover in Toulon, had been ignored. Hood, with Parker advising him, had made an arrangement with the French Admiral Trogoff that smacked to Hotham of disloyalty to his own fellow sailors and his government. What did the man mean by holding the enemy fleet in trust? Was he proposing, should the revolution collapse, to hand back to a restored French king all the ships now under British control? Hotham's correspondence with his political allies at home had certainly questioned the arrangement, and if they had not gone as far as to doubt Hood's sanity, they had most certainly implied that his judgment was deeply flawed, the concomitant of that being he should be relieved, which would naturally mean his own rise to the command.
So far he had good grounds, taken from the replies he had received, to feel his views were considered sound, which meant his supporters could apply pressure on William Pitt and a king who had no love for Lord Hood to call the man home. Farmer George might prove sticky. He disliked Whigs more than he disliked Hood. Yet that damned court-martial, if represented to those same correspondents in the wrong way, could entirely undermine his position. If Hood carried out his threat to add a reservation on the judgment to his confirmation, no doubt laying all the possible questions at the Hotham door, it would almost certainly prompt a degree of curiosity by the Board of Admiralty, of which Hood was still, albeit in absentia, a member. It might even develop into a full inquiry if Hood felt the need to ensure his innocence in any wrongdoing. If anyone had said to William Hotham's face that he was a political admiral, he would have happily accepted the designation. To him all admirals were politicians, the only difference being the degree of their ability to navigate the shark-infested waters of that dubious world. Hood was a dyed-in-the-wool Tory. He, Hotham, was a loyal Whig, but enough of a pragmatist to see why the Duke of Portland had decided to join the government. This damned French Revolution had to be defeated before it consumed the whole of Europe with its pernicious doctrines. Party politics could be put in abeyance until that was achieved. Being a self-confessed politician meant his mind would not long chase a problem. Instead, he began to look for solutions. First, he had to disappoint Berkeley, but that he would do in such a way as to ensure Hood would bear the brunt of that man's anger, and in such a way as to limit the damage to his own standing. The next thing he needed was intimate knowledge of the truth. What had actually happened that night Berkeley had gone pressing men in the liberties of the Savoy? Looking at his copy of the transcript, one name leapt out at him. He could not ask Ralph Berkeley for candour. That would be too demeaning in the request, and he doubted if it would be entirely honest in the explanation. "Willis!" he called, and in seconds his first secretary appeared. "I have a mind to ask Captain Berkeley and his wife to dinner." "Would tonight be suitable, sir? You're hosting a dinner for General O'Hara and the newly arrived officers from Gibraltar." Hotham nodded slowly, then added, "And since one of Captain Berkeley's midshipmen is nephew to his wife, it might be a kindness to have him along too." "I have no desire to dine with an admiral," Emily insisted, still flustered to find her husband visiting her at the hospital. Given his duties ashore, and hers here, they now saw very little of each other, which suited Emily if it did not Ralph Berkeley. In his mind she was the author of all their disagreements, having completely forfeited what he saw as her first duty, loyalty to him as his spouse. It never entered his head that Emily's view was the polar opposite. She saw his behaviour as shameful, his many deceits as contemptible, and the naval practices he not only defended but, as she had observed, was happy to apply, as bordering on barbarism. "I fear, Mrs. Berkeley, I must insist. You may not appreciate how necessary it is for a man of my rank to have a senior officer as a sponsor in the service, but I do, and since Sir William has undertaken that role, for you to refuse to attend would be nothing short of an insult, and moreover one that could harm my standing in his eyes." "I can plead an indisposition." "You cannot." "We shall see if that is the case." For the first time in their married life, Ralph Berkeley treated her with the same lack of consideration he habitually used with other people. In his mind, at that precise moment, he saw himself as being too indulgent of his wife, and because of that he had allowed her to misunderstand the duties that went with married life. He would not beat her, though there was no law that debarred him from doing so, but he would command her. It had to be. There was no other way for a man and wife to coexist if the lesser, female party was not going to comply with the standard expected of them. "This discussion is at an end. I am your husband, and you will obey me. The cutter will come for you at 1 o'clock. Shenton will have ready your wardrobe, so you may select what you are going to wear. Dinner is at 3.
and we must be aboard HMS Britannia well before that time. Please be advised, my dear, that my men will be instructed to ensure your return to HMS Brilliant, and as their captain, they will obey me."
For a moment, as a way of softening his stricture, Ralph Barclay was tempted to tell her of his proposed promotion. But he decided to do as he had done so far, keep it to a more suitable moment. She would surely see in that a vindication of his actions. Not that he thought one was required, but to a person not familiar with the ways of the Navy, and especially to a woman, it might prove necessary. No, he would wait and let it be a surprise, perhaps coming from the lips of Sir William Hotham, and in a cabin not dissimilar in size to the one to which she would be moving. Emily would begin to comprehend things that were to her now mysterious.
Sir William had also, as a courtesy to you, asked that we take along Toby.
With a clear notion of the way the youngster had avoided her recently, Emily replied, "I doubt he will want to come."
"Nonsense! You may have little idea of the flattering nature of such an invitation, but I'm sure your nephew is somewhat wiser. Midshipmen not serving on flagships are rarely issued with such a chance to impress."
"You are sure Toby will impress?" Ralph Barclay misunderstood the irony in his wife's tone.
"He will, as long as he behaves himself."
"I fear, my dear Emily," said Heinrich Lutyens, "that I must advise you to do as you are asked. So you, too, subscribe to the notion of woman as an inferior being. You will be telling me that you were not raised to accept as true that very estate." Those words prompted a wan smile from Emily. She had indeed been so raised. Had not her mother deferred to her father in all things, even when he had patently been in the wrong, using subterfuge to gain her ends rather than confrontation? That had been the advice she had been given before her nuptials. How to get her own way while seeming to succumb to the male viewpoint, along with the information that men had weaknesses of a carnal nature, which must be indulged whenever the demand was made. She was no stranger to the vision of procreation. There had been enough of that going on at home in the chicken run, the pig pens, and the paddock to make it plain to even the blind. Odd that, taking for granted what animals did, never translated into an early explanation of what would be required of her. She had wondered why her mother had waited till the night before her wedding to tell her certain things. After the wedding night she knew very well. It had been damned unpleasant, and although since then she had approached her husband's advances with less in the way of fear, it could hardly be said to be an uplifting obligation. "The Navy is a small world, my dear," Lutyens continued. "Your relations with your husband are, I should think, already common knowledge." "You mean I'm the subject of gossip?" "Very likely. And to avoid being more so, indeed to avoid the unwelcome attentions of those who might seek to take advantage of it, for there are as many rakes in the service as there are in other walks of life, I should go with your husband, and behave in a manner to allay such talk." "You are a cruel friend, Heinrich." "But I am a friend, Emily." Chapter 7. In the fresh dawn light on the quayside, the two British officers were surprised to be greeted by a guard of honour, the salute of weapons executed in a disciplined manner, neither man associated with the present soldiery of the French Republic. The fellow who brought them to the salute was another, more senior lieutenant, and he did so, hat raised high, with a civility more redolent of the old days of the monarchy. He also, to Digby's delight, spoke very reasonable English. "It is my pleasure, monsieur, to ask you to accompany me to the headquarters of the port captain, where my superiors await your attendance." "Obliged," Digby replied, indicating the fellow should proceed, this while the cutter that had fetched them hauled clear of the shore. As they moved along the stone quay, their guard of honour, in no way threateningly, lined up on either side, and with the same level of correct order proceeded to march, muskets at the slope. Being a port dating back to Roman times, the alleyways leading off the quay were dark and narrow, but the buildings facing the sea were substantial and spoke of a degree of prosperity. The number of people idling about surprised Pearce, until he reasoned that with a British sloop sitting off the coast, few of the fishing vessels had put to sea. The lieutenant, having indicated that they had arrived by calling halt to the guard, led them up a set of stone steps into the cool hallway of the port captain's headquarters, both men requiring a moment to adjust their eyes to the interior darkness after the strong outdoor sunlight, until they were invited to enter a well-lit room overlooking the harbour. The two French captains were there, in full dress, hats included, standing and waiting for these emissaries, and as soon as they entered the room, the escorting lieutenant exited, closing the door behind him.
"Monsieur,"
said the older of the two, speaking French, nothing on his lined and weathered face denoting either fear or caution.
"allow me to introduce to you Lieutenant Bertin, who commands Vestal. I am Captain Fourreau of Bondine. I have reason to believe you carry a message to us from your superiors occupying Toulon."
It was Pearce who had to reply, introducing both himself and Digby before handing over the satchel. Fourreau took out the letters and examined the superscriptions, but he did not break the seals.
"I think I can guess what these contain."
"It would be as well to read them, sir," Pearce replied. "Then you will understand the true depth of the sentiments expressed." Fourreau nodded, but he did not speak for a long while. Asking pardon, he began a whispered conversation with his colleague, and that became rather animated, hinting at a disagreement, which had Digby seeking a sotto voce explanation which Pearce could not provide. Whatever, when it ended, Fourreau went to a desk and picked up a blunt-looking knife. He was just about to break the seal on the first letter when the sound came through the door of some kind of commotion, raised and demanding voices. Frozen with his hand in mid-act, Fourreau was quick to hide the letter-opener, and it was obvious to Pearce, given the way the blood drained from his face, that the sight of the man who occupied the doorway, a burly and scarred individual in the uniform of the National Guard, was not one he welcomed.
"I bring a message from the Hôtel de Ville," the man barked. "You and these two Englishmen are to attend there at once."
"A message from whom?"
"Commissioner Barras."
Fourreau moved between Pearce and the doorway. The letters behind his back waved in such an abrupt manner that there seemed little alternative but to take them. Digby was looking at his subordinate, wondering what was afoot, and left in ignorance by a man who still had no idea. But he did hear the French captain's reply.
"There is no need for such a summons, citizen. I was about to suggest that is where we must go." "Glad to hear it," replied the messenger. "But I wouldn't delay. Citizen Barras does not like to be kept waiting, and he's the easy-going one."
"Who," Pearce asked as the head disappeared, "is Citizen Barras?" He was talking to Fourreau's back. He and Bertin were already making their way out of the door, though the voice floated back to him.
"A man we must not keep waiting."
"Pearce?"
"I would say, sir, that if we are allowed, we should immediately make our way back to HMS Pharaon."
"From your tone," Digby replied, "I think you do not see that as likely." The same escort of Marines awaited them on the quay, but this time they were headed by the burly National Guardsman, who ordered them to take station around all four naval officers before the whole party set off, eventually turning into a reasonably wide thoroughfare which led towards the centre of the town. That soon opened out into the kind of open piazza so beloved by the ancients, dominated on one side by a cathedral, on the other by a large, square-fronted edifice with iron gates flying on a flagpole the tricolour of the Revolution. Naturally, the sight of four naval officers, two in the dark blue coats of King George's Navy, added to the interest created by the mere presence of a British vessel in the bay, and this ensured a lively and curious crowd was there to dog their heels, making noisy, yet not threatening calls to be informed what was afoot. The escort was halted by the gateway, and the quartet were led into the atrium of what had to be the Hôtel de Ville,
to be greeted by a trio of men in high hats, black coats and breeches, shiny black boots, and the huge, colourful red, white and blue sashes of the Revolution round their waist. Pearce knew what they were. He had met one of their number in La Rochelle, and it was not a sight to cheer him. Representatives on mission of the Committee of Public Safety, they were the emissaries of the body politic, made up of regicides who now ran France. To a man they were smirking, as though bearing witness to some kind of theatrical farce, and he was also regretting the way he had edged Digby into coming ashore, for in dealing with people like these, his own trust in the protection provided by his truce flag was less than certain.
"Please, Capitaine Fourreau, introduce our visitors."
The one who had spoken was, Pearce guessed, around 40, somewhat corpulent, with a face and manner that seemed too benign for the office he occupied. The other two, although very different, conformed to type, one a swarthy individual with a curved nose and black unblinking eyes, the other a young and pallid-looking fellow, tall and skinny, who looked, with his parchment skin, like a wrongly dressed priest. Fourreau obliged with the introductions, and unbidden named the men of whom he was clearly in some trepidation.
"A Commissioner of the Army, Barras. Representatives on mission, Messieurs Fréron and Robespierre."
The name made Pearce look closely. He knew of a Robespierre from his time in Paris, a dry and atheistic lawyer who was one of the stars of the Jacobin Club, as well as a radical proponent of outre ideas in the National Convention. He had become more than that now. He was the leading light of the Committee of Public Safety, so this fellow could not be him. Besides, he was too young, but he must be, given it was not a common name, a relation of some kind. And that was a worrying thought. No one moved for half a minute, until the Frenchman called Barras held out his hand, forcing Pearce to hand over the letters, which could well be their death warrant. He gave over the satchel as well, on the very good grounds that it would cease to be an encumbrance if he had to try and defend himself, though both he and Digby, as befitted the flag under which they operated, were unarmed. "Pearce?" Digby had given him a curious look, and a very slight gesture of the head to indicate the black-clad trio. "Say nothing, sir. Just wait." The seals on the letters were broken and the contents read in turn, with much nodding of the head and murmuring to each other. When they finished and looked at the two British officers, their faces had changed. From looking bland, they now looked angry.
"You have not read these, Capitaine Fourreau?" asked Barras, without looking at that officer.
"No." The man smiled, which was chilling, not cheerful.
"You would like the contents. Milord Hood offers you amnesty, while the traitor Trogoff invites you to take your frigates to Toulon. The third one is curious.
Robespierre butted in, which produced a look on the face of Barras that underlined the interruption was not welcome. That led Pearce to wonder if there was a competition for supremacy in this trio of probable regicides. If there was, could that help him and Digby?
"It is from the Spaniard, Admiral Langara," Robespierre spat, "and it is addressed to General Lapuip and the Army of Italy, instructing them for their own good to stay out of that country."
"The revolution goes where it pleases," said Fréron, in a voice that made it sound like a mantra.
"One wonders," Robespierre demanded, his voice as cold as the expression on his pallid face, "how this missive was supposed to be delivered. I cannot see it in the hands of a British officer being handed over to the general. Perhaps they felt so sure of you, Capitaine, or maybe it was you, Bertin, to deliver it for them. Indeed, it seems to me there is a conspiracy here."
"Did you have any communication with Toulon before these came?" asked Barras, waving the letters.
"None."
"That I find hard to believe," Robespierre said, with Fréron nodding at the statement.
"I think," Barras insisted, "any examination of the motives of these two officers can wait. The question we must deal with now is what to do with our two visitors."
"The guillotine can take care of that."
If Digby knew no French, he knew that word. Pearce felt rather than saw his body jerk. Barras turned to Robespierre, his face questioning.
But, Augustine, they have come under a flag of truce.
They have come as spies, Robespierre spat, and they should die like spies, Fréron. For the first time, the swarthy face of that representative lost the look of supreme confidence. Clearly he detected a difference, and did not want to have to decide on whom to support.
End of CD 3.